Once again, in this phase of the dream, the patient is acknowledging his failure to experience to the full an important aspect of childhood and early adolescence. He missed out on the playfulness of the child and also on the rather more advanced pranks of the young teenager, and he is seeking ways in which those lost experiences and personal qualities can be rehabilitated. Next comes a curious change in the dream. The young man in black appears, and for a moment the dreamer feels that this is the true hero. That is all we are told about the man in black. Yet this fleeting glimpse introduces a theme of profound importance, a theme that occurs frequently in dreams. This is the concept of the shadow, which plays such a vital role in analytical psychology. Dr. Jung has pointed out that the shadow cast by the conscious mind of the individual contains the hidden, repressed, and unfavorable or nefarious aspects of the personality. But this darkness is not just the simple converse of the conscious ego. Just as the ego contains unfavorable and destructive attitudes, so the shadow has good qualities, normal instincts and creative impulses. Ego and shadow, indeed, although separate, are inextricably linked together in much the same way that thought and feeling are related to each other. The ego, nevertheless, is in conflict with the shadow, in what Dr. Jung once called the battle for deliverance. In the struggle of primitive man to achieve consciousness, this conflict is expressed by the contest between the archetypal hero and the cosmic powers of evil, personified by dragons and other monsters. In the developing consciousness of the individual, the hero figure is the symbolic means by which the emerging ego overcomes the inertia of the unconscious mind and liberates the mature man from a regressive longing to return to the blissful state of infancy in a world dominated by his mother. Usually, in mythology, the hero wins his battle against the monster. I shall say more about this in a moment. But there are other hero myths in which the hero gives in to the monster. A familiar type is that of Jonah and the whale, in which the hero is swallowed by a sea monster that carries him on a night sea journey from west to east, thus symbolizing the supposed transit of the sun from sunset to dawn. The hero goes into darkness, which represents a kind of death. I have encountered this theme in dreams presented in my own clinical experience. The battle between the hero and the dragon is the more active form of this myth, and it shows more clearly the archetypal theme of the ego's triumph over regressive trends. For most people, the dark or negative side of the personality remains unconscious. The hero, on the contrary, must realize that the shadow exists and that he can draw strength from it. He must come to terms with its destructive powers if he is to become sufficiently terrible to overcome the dragon. That is, before the ego can triumph, it must master and assimilate the shadow. One can see this theme, incidentally, in a well-known literary hero figure, Goethe's character of Faust. In accepting the wager of Mephistopheles, Faust put himself in the power of a shadow figure that Goethe describes as part of that power which, willing evil, finds the good. Like the man whose dream I have been discussing, Faust had failed to live out to the full an important part of his early life. He was, accordingly, an unreal or incomplete person who lost himself in a fruitless quest for metaphysical goals that failed to materialize. He was still unwilling to accept life's challenge to live both the good and the bad. It is to this aspect of the unconscious that the young man in black in my patient's dream seems to refer. Such a reminder of the shadow side of his personality, of its powerful potential, and its role in preparing the hero for the struggles of life, is an essential transition from the earlier parts of the dream to the theme of the sacrificial hero, the handsome young man who places himself on an altar. This figure represents the form of heroism that is commonly associated to the ego-building process of late adolescence. A man expresses the ideal principles of his life at this time, sensing their power both to transform himself and to change his relations with others. He is, so to speak, in the bloom of youth, attractive, full of energy and idealism. Why, then, does he willingly offer himself as a human sacrifice? The reason, presumably, is the same as that which made the twins of the Winnebago myth give up their power on pain of destruction. The idealism of youth, which drives one so hard, is bound to lead to overconfidence. The human ego can be exalted to experience godlike attributes, but only at the cost of overreaching itself and falling to disaster. This is the meaning of the story of Icarus, the youth who is carried up to heaven on his fragile, humanly contrived wings, but who flies too close to the sun and plunges to his doom. All the same, the youthful ego must always run this risk, for if a young man does not strive for a higher goal than he can safely reach, he cannot surmount the obstacles between adolescence and maturity. So far, I have been talking about the conclusions that at the level of his personal associations, my patient could draw from his own dream. Yet there is an archetypal level of the dream, the mystery of the proffered human sacrifice. It is precisely because it is a mystery that it is expressed in a ritual act that in its symbolism carries us a long way back into man's history. Here, as the man lies stretched out on an altar, we see a reference to an act even more primitive than those performed on the altar stone in the temple at Stonehenge. There, as on so many primitive altars, we can imagine a yearly solstice rite combined with the death and rebirth of a mythological hero. The ritual has a sorrow about it that is also a kind of joy, an inward acknowledgement that death also leads to a new life. Whether it is expressed in the prose epic of the Winnebago Indians, in a lament for the death of Balder in the Norse Eddas, in Walt Whitman's poems of mourning for Abraham Lincoln, or in the dream ritual whereby a man returns to his youthful hopes and fears, it is the same theme, the drama of new birth through death. The end of the dream brings out a curious epilogue in which the dreamer at last becomes involved in the action of the dream. He and others are on a platform from which they have to descend. He does not trust the ladder because of the possible interference of hoodlums, but a woman encourages him to believe he can go down safely, and this is accomplished. Since I found out from his associations that the whole performance he witnessed was part of his analysis, a process of inner change that he was experiencing, he was presumably thinking of the difficulty of getting back to everyday reality again. His fear of the toughs, as he calls them, suggests his fear that the trickster archetype may appear in a collective form. The saving elements in the dream are the man-made ladder, which here is probably a symbol of the rational mind, and the presence of the woman who encourages the dreamer to use it. Her appearance in the final sequence of the dream points to a psychic need to include a feminine principle as a complement to all this excessively masculine activity. It should not be assumed from what I have said, or from the fact that I have chosen to use the Winnebago myth to illuminate this particular dream, that one must seek for complete and wholly mechanical parallels between a dream and the materials one can find in the history of mythology. Each dream is individual to the dreamer, and the precise form it takes is determined by his own situation. What I have sought to show is the manner in which the unconscious draws on this archetypal material and modifies its patterns to the dreamer's needs. Thus, in this particular dream, one must not look for a direct reference to what the Winnebago describe in the red horn or twin cycles. The reference is rather to the essence of those two themes, to the sacrificial element in them. As a general rule, it can be said that the need for hero symbols arises when the ego needs strengthening, when, that is to say, the conscious mind needs assistance in some task that it cannot accomplish unaided or without drawing on the sources of strength that lie in the unconscious mind. In the dream I have been discussing, for instance, there was no reference to one of the more important aspects of the myth of the typical hero, his capacity to save or protect beautiful women from terrible danger. The damsel in distress was a favorite myth of medieval Europe. This is one way in which myths or dreams refer to the anima, the feminine element of the male psyche that Goethe called the eternal feminine. The nature and function of this female element will be discussed later in this book by Dr. von Franz, but its relation to the hero figure can be illustrated here by a dream produced by another patient, also a man of mature years. He began by saying, "I had returned from a long hike through India. A woman had equipped myself and a friend for the journey, and on my return I reproached her for failing to give us black rain hats, telling her that through this oversight we had been soaked by the rain." This introduction to the dream, it later emerged, referred to a period in this man's youth when he was given to taking heroic walks through dangerous mountain country in company with a college friend. As he had never been to India, and in view of his own associations to this dream, I concluded that the dream journey signified his exploration of a new region, not, that is to say, a real place, but the realm of the unconscious. In his dream, the patient seems to feel that a woman, presumably a personification of his anima, has failed to prepare him properly for this expedition. The lack of a suitable rain hat suggests that he feels in an unprotected state of mind in which he is uncomfortably affected by exposure to new and not altogether pleasant experiences. He believes that the woman should have provided a rain hat for him, just as his mother provided clothes for him to wear as a boy. This episode is reminiscent of his early picaresque wanderings when he was sustained by the assumption that his mother, the original feminine image, would protect him against all dangers. As he grew older, he saw that this was a childish illusion, and he now blames his misfortune on his own anima, not his mother. In the next stage of the dream, the patient speaks of participating in a hike with a group of people. He grows tired and returns to an outdoor restaurant, where he finds his raincoat, together with the rain hat that he had missed earlier. He sits down to rest, and as he does so, he notices a poster stating that a local high school boy is taking the part of Perseus in a play. Then the boy in question appears, who turns out to be not a boy at all, but a husky young man. He is dressed in gray with a black hat, and he sits down to talk with another young man dressed in a black suit. Immediately after this scene, the dreamer feels a new vigor and finds that he is capable of rejoining his party. They all then climb over the next hill. There, below them, he sees their destination. It is a lovely harbor town. He feels both heartened and rejuvenated by the discovery. Here, in contrast to the restless, uncomfortable, and lonely journey of the first episode, the dreamer is with a group. The contrast marks a change from an earlier pattern of isolation and youthful protest to the socializing influence of a relation to others. Since this implies a new capacity for relatedness, it suggests that his anima must now be functioning better than it was before, symbolized by his discovery of the missing hat that the anima figure had previously failed to provide for him. But the dreamer is tired, and the scene at the restaurant reflects his need to look at his earlier attitudes in a new light with the hope of renewing his strength by this regression. And so it turns out. What he first sees is a poster suggesting the enactment of a youthful hero role, a high school boy playing the part of Perseus. Then he sees the boy, now a man, with a friend who makes a sharp contrast to him. The one dressed in light gray, the other in black, can be recognized from what I have previously said as a version of the twins. They are hero figures expressing the opposites of ego and alter ego, which, however, appear here in a harmonious and unified relation. The patient's associations confirmed this and emphasized that the figure in gray represents a well-adapted worldly attitude to life, whereas the figure in black represents the spiritual life, in the sense that a clergyman wears black. That they wore hats, and he now had found his own, points to their having achieved a relatively mature identity of a kind that he had felt to be severely lacking in his own earlier adolescent years, when the quality of tricksterism still clung to him in spite of his idealistic self-image as a seeker of wisdom. His association to the Greek hero Perseus was a curious one, which proved especially significant because it revealed a glaring inaccuracy. It turned out that he thought Perseus was the hero who slew the Minotaur and rescued Ariadne from the Cretan labyrinth. As he wrote the name down for me, he discovered his mistake, that it was Theseus, not Perseus, who slew the Minotaur. And this mistake became suddenly meaningful, as such slips often do, by making him notice what these two heroes had in common. They both had to overcome their fear of unconscious demonic maternal powers and had to liberate from these powers a single youthful feminine figure. Perseus had to cut off the head of the Gorgon Medusa, whose horrifying visage and snaky locks turned all who gazed upon them to stone. He later had to overcome the dragon that guarded Andromeda. Theseus represented the young patriarchal spirit of Athens, who had to brave the terrors of the Cretan labyrinth with its monstrous inmate the Minotaur, which perhaps symbolized the unhealthy decadence of matriarchal Crete. In all cultures, the labyrinth has the meaning of an entangling and confusing representation of the world of matriarchal consciousness. It can be traversed only by those who are ready for a special initiation into the mysterious world of the collective unconscious. Having overcome this danger, Theseus rescued Ariadne, a maiden in distress. This rescue symbolizes the liberation of the anima figure from the devouring aspect of the mother image. Not until this is accomplished can a man achieve his first true capacity for relatedness to women. The fact that this man had failed adequately to separate the anima from the mother was emphasized in another dream, in which he encountered a dragon, a symbolic image for the devouring aspect of his attachment to his mother. This dragon pursued him, and because he had no weapon, he began to get the worst of the struggle. Significantly, however, his wife appeared in the dream, and her appearance somehow made the dragon smaller and less threatening. This change in the dream showed that in his marriage, the dreamer was belatedly overcoming the attachment to his mother. In other words, he had to find a means of freeing the psychic energy attached to the mother-son relationship in order to achieve a more adult relation to women, and indeed to adult society as a whole. The hero-dragon battle was the symbolic expression of this process of growing up. But the hero's task has an aim that goes beyond biological and marital adjustment. It is to liberate the anima as that inner component of the psyche that is necessary for any true creative achievement. In this man's case, we have to guess the probability of this outcome because it is not directly stated in the dream of the Indian journey. But I am sure he would confirm my hypothesis that his journey over the hill and the sight of his goal as a peaceful harbor town contained the rich promise that he would discover his authentic anima function. He would thus be cured of his early resentment at not being given protection, the rain hat, by the woman for his journey through India. In dreams, significantly placed towns can often be anima symbols. The man had won this promise of security for himself by his contact with the authentic hero archetype and had found a new cooperative and related attitude to the group. His sense of rejuvenation naturally followed. He had drawn on the inner source of strength that the hero archetype represents. He had clarified and developed that part of him which was symbolized by the woman, and he had, by his ego's heroic act, liberated himself from his mother. These and many other examples of the hero myth in modern dreams show that the ego as hero is always essentially a bearer of culture rather than a purely egocentric exhibitionist. Even Trickster, in his misguided or unpurposive way, is a contributor to the cosmos as primitive man sees it. In Navajo mythology, as Coyote, he hurled the stars into the sky as an act of creation. He invented the necessary contingency of death, and in the myth of emergence, he helped lead the people through the hollow reed, whereby they escaped from one world to another above it, where they were safe from the threat of flood. We have here a reference to that form of creative evolution which evidently begins on a childlike, preconscious, or animal level of existence. The ego's rise to effective conscious action becomes plain in the true culture hero. In the same fashion, the childish or adolescent ego frees itself from the oppression of parental expectations and becomes individual. As part of this rise to consciousness, the hero-dragon battle may have to be fought and refought to liberate energy for the multitude of human tasks that can form a culture pattern out of chaos. When this is successful, we see the full hero image emerging as a kind of ego strength, or, if we are speaking in collective terms, a tribal identity that has no further need to overcome the monsters and the giants. It has reached the point where these deep forces can be personalized. The feminine element no longer appears in dreams as a dragon, but as a woman. Similarly, the shadow side of the personality takes on a less menacing form. This important point is illustrated in the dream of a man nearing 50. All his life he had suffered from periodic attacks of anxiety associated with fear of failure, originally engendered by a doubting mother. Yet his actual achievements, both in his profession and in his personal relations, were well above average. In his dream, his 9-year-old son appeared as a young man of about 18 or 19, dressed in the shining armor of a medieval knight. The young man is called upon to fight a host of men in black, which he prepares at first to do. Then he suddenly removes his helmet and smiles at the leader of the menacing host. It is clear that they will not engage in the battle, but will become friends. The son in the dream is the man's own youthful ego, which had frequently felt threatened by the shadow in the form of self-doubt. He had, in a sense, waged a successful crusade against this adversary all his mature life. Now, partly through the actual encouragement of seeing his son grow up without such doubts, but mainly by forming a suitable image of the hero in the form closest to his own environmental pattern, he finds it no longer necessary to fight the shadow. He can accept it. That is what is symbolized in the act of friendship. He is no longer driven to a competitive struggle for individual supremacy, but is assimilated to the cultural task of forming a democratic sort of community. Such a conclusion, reached in the fullness of life, goes beyond the heroic task and leads one to a truly mature attitude. This change, however, does not take place automatically. It requires a period of transition, which is expressed in the various forms of the archetype of initiation. The archetype of initiation. In a psychological sense, the hero image is not to be regarded as identical with the ego proper. It is better described as the symbolic means by which the ego separates itself from the archetypes evoked by the parental images in early childhood. Dr. Jung has suggested that each human being has originally a feeling of wholeness, a powerful and complete sense of the self, and from the self, the totality of the psyche, the individualized ego consciousness emerges as the individual grows up. Within the past few years, the works of certain followers of Jung have begun to document the series of events by which the individual ego emerges during the transition from infancy through childhood. This separation can never become final without severe injury to the original sense of wholeness, and the ego must continually return to reestablish its relation to the self in order to maintain a condition of psychic health. It would appear from my studies that the hero myth is the first stage in the differentiation of the psyche. I have suggested that it seems to go through a fourfold cycle by which the ego seeks to achieve its relative autonomy from the original condition of wholeness. Unless some degree of autonomy is achieved, the individual is unable to relate himself to his adult environment. But the hero myth does not ensure that this liberation will occur. It only shows how it is possible for it to occur, so that the ego may achieve consciousness. There remains the problem of maintaining and developing that consciousness in a meaningful way so that the individual can live a useful life and can achieve the necessary sense of self-distinction in society. Ancient history and the rituals of contemporary primitive societies have provided us with a wealth of material about myths and rites of initiation whereby young men and women are weaned away from their parents and forcibly made members of their clan or tribe. But in making this break with the childhood world, the original parent archetype will be injured, and the damage must be made good by a healing process of assimilation into the life of the group. The identity of the group and the individual is often symbolized by a totem animal. Thus, the group fulfills the claims of the injured archetype and becomes a kind of second parent to which the young are first symbolically sacrificed, only to re-emerge into a new life. In this drastic ceremony, which looks very like a sacrifice to the powers that might hold the young man back, as Dr. Jung has put it, we see how the power of the original archetype can never be permanently overcome in the manner envisaged by the hero-dragon battle, without a crippling sense of alienation from the fruitful powers of the unconscious. We saw in the myth of the twins how their hubris, expressing excessive ego self-separation, was corrected by their own fear of the consequences, which forced them back into a harmonious ego-self relation. In tribal societies, it is the initiation rite that most effectively solves this problem. The ritual takes the novice back to the deepest level of original mother-child identity or ego-self-identity, thus forcing him to experience a symbolic death. In other words, his identity is temporarily dismembered or dissolved in the collective unconscious. From this state, he is then ceremonially rescued by the rite of the new birth. This is the first act of true consolidation of the ego with the larger group, expressed as totem, clan, or tribe, or all three combined. The ritual, whether it is found in tribal groups or in more complex societies, invariably insists upon this rite of death and rebirth, which provides the novice with a rite of passage from one stage of life to the next, whether it is from early childhood to later childhood, or from early to late adolescence, and from then to maturity. Initiatory events are not, of course, confined to the psychology of youth. Every new phase of development throughout an individual's life is accompanied by a repetition of the original conflict between the claims of the self and the claims of the ego. In fact, this conflict may be expressed more powerfully at the period of transition from early maturity to middle age, between 35 and 40 in our society, than at any other time in life. And the transition from middle age to old age creates again the need for affirmation of the difference between the ego and the total psyche. The hero receives his last call to action in defense of ego consciousness against the approaching dissolution of life in death. At these crucial periods, the archetype of initiation is strongly activated to provide a meaningful transition that offers something more spiritually satisfying than the adolescent rites with their strong secular flavor. The archetypal patterns of initiation in this religious sense, known since ancient times as the mysteries, are woven into the texture of all ecclesiastical rituals requiring a special manner of worship at the time of birth, marriage, or death. As in our study of the hero myth, so in the study of initiation, we must look for examples in the subjective experiences of modern people, and especially of those who have undergone analysis. It is not surprising that there should appear in the unconscious of someone who is seeking help from a doctor specializing in psychic disorders images that duplicate the major patterns of initiation as we know them from history. Perhaps the commonest of these themes to be found in young people is the ordeal or trial of strength. This might seem to be identical with what we have already noticed in modern dreams illustrating the hero myth, such as the sailor who had to submit to the weather and to beatings, or that proof of fitness represented in the hike through India of the man without a rain hat. We can also see this theme of physical suffering carried to its logical end in the first dream I discussed, when the handsome young man became a human sacrifice on an altar. This sacrifice resembled the approach to initiation, but its end was obscured. It seemed to round off the hero cycle, to make way for a new theme. There is one striking difference between the hero myth and the initiation rite. The typical hero figures exhaust their efforts in achieving the goal of their ambitions. In short, they become successful even if immediately afterward they are punished or killed for their hubris. In contrast to this, the novice for initiation is called upon to give up willful ambition and all desire and to submit to the ordeal. He must be willing to experience this trial without hope of success. In fact, he must be prepared to die. And though the token of his ordeal may be mild, a period of fasting, the knocking out of a tooth or tattooing, or agonizing, the infliction of the wounds of circumcision, subincision, or other mutilations, the purpose remains always the same, to create the symbolic mood of death from which may spring the symbolic mood of rebirth. A young man of 25 dreams of climbing a mountain, on top of which there is a kind of altar. Near the altar, he sees a sarcophagus with a statue of himself upon it. Then a veiled priest approaches, carrying a staff on which there glows a living sun disk. Discussing the dream later, the young man said that climbing a mountain reminded him of the effort he was making in his analysis to achieve self-mastery. To his surprise, he finds himself, as it were, dead, and instead of a sense of achievement, he feels deprivation and fear. Then comes a feeling of strength and rejuvenation as he is bathed in the warm rays of the sun disk. This dream shows quite succinctly the distinction we must make between initiation and the hero myth. The act of climbing the mountain seems to suggest a trial of strength. It is the will to achieve ego consciousness in the heroic phase of adolescent development. The patient had evidently thought that his approach to therapy would be like his approach to other tests of manhood, which he had approached in the competitive manner characteristic of young men in our society. But the scene by the altar corrected this mistaken assumption, showing him that his task is rather to submit to a power greater than himself. He must see himself as if he were dead and entombed in a symbolic form, the sarcophagus, that recalls the archetypal mother as the original container of all life. Only by such an act of submission can he experience rebirth. An invigorating ritual brings him to life again, as the symbolic son of a son-father. Here again, we might confuse this with a hero cycle, that of the twins, the children of the sun. But in this case, we have no indication that the initiate will overreach himself. Instead, he has learned the lesson in humility by experiencing a rite of death and rebirth that marks his passage from youth to maturity. According to his chronological age, he should already have made this transition, but a prolonged period of arrested development has held him back. This delay had plunged him into a neurosis for which he had come for treatment, and the dream offers him the same wise counsel that he could have been given by any good tribal medicine man, that he should give up scaling mountains to prove his strength and submit to the meaningful ritual of an initiatory change that could fit him for the new moral responsibilities of manhood. The theme of submission as an essential attitude toward promotion of the successful initiation rite can be clearly seen in the case of girls or women. Their rite of passage initially emphasizes their essential passivity, and this is reinforced by the psychological limitation on their autonomy imposed by the menstrual cycle. It has been suggested that the menstrual cycle may actually be the major part of initiation from a woman's point of view, since it has the power to awaken the deepest sense of obedience to life's creative power over her. Thus she willingly gives herself to her womanly function, much as a man gives himself to his assigned role in the community life of his group. On the other hand, the woman, no less than the man, has her initial trials of strength that lead to a final sacrifice for the sake of experiencing the new birth. This sacrifice enables a woman to free herself from the entanglement of personal relations and fits her for a more conscious role as an individual in her own right. In contrast, a man's sacrifice is a surrender of his sacred independence. He becomes more consciously related to woman. Here we come to that aspect of initiation which acquaints man with woman and woman with man in such a way as to correct some sort of original male-female opposition. Man's knowledge, logos, then encounters woman's relatedness, eros, and their union is represented as that symbolic ritual of a sacred marriage which has been at the heart of initiation since its origins in the mystery religions of antiquity. But this is exceedingly difficult for modern people to grasp, and it frequently takes a special crisis in their lives to make them understand it. Several patients have told me dreams in which the motif of sacrifice is combined with the motif of the sacred marriage. One of these was produced by a young man who had fallen in love but was unwilling to marry for fear that marriage would become a kind of prison presided over by a powerful mother figure. His own mother had been a strong influence in his childhood, and his future mother-in-law presented a similar threat. Would not his wife-to-be dominate him in the same way these mothers had dominated their children? In his dream, he was engaged in a ritual dance, along with another man and two other women, one of whom was his fiancée. The others were an older man and wife, who impressed the dreamer because, despite their closeness to each other, they seemed to have room for their individual differences and did not appear to be possessive. These two, therefore, represented to this young man a married state that did not impose undue constraint on the development of the individual nature of the two partners. If it were possible for him to achieve this condition, marriage would then become acceptable to him. In the ritual dance, each man faced his woman partner, and all four took their places at the corners of a square dancing ground. As they danced, it became apparent that this was also a kind of sword dance. Each dancer had in his hand a short sword with which to perform a difficult arabesque, moving arms and legs in a series of movements that suggested alternate impulses of aggression and submission to each other. In the final scene of the dance, all four dancers had to plunge the swords into their own breasts and die. Only the dreamer refused to accomplish the final suicide and was left standing alone after the others had fallen. He felt deeply ashamed of his cowardly failure to sacrifice himself with the others. This dream brought home to my patient the fact that he was more than ready to change his attitude to life. He had been self-centered, seeking the illusory safety of personal independence, but inwardly dominated by the fears caused by childhood subjection to his mother. He needed a challenge to his manhood in order to see that unless he sacrificed his childish state of mind, he would be left isolated and ashamed. The dream, and his subsequent insight into its meaning, dispelled his doubts. He had passed through the symbolic rite by which a young man gives up his exclusive autonomy and accepts his shared life in a related, not just heroic, form. And so he married and found appropriate fulfillment in his relationship with his wife. Far from impairing his effectiveness in the world, his marriage actually enhanced it. Quite apart from the neurotic fear that invisible mothers or fathers may be lurking behind the marriage veil, even the normal young man has good reason to feel apprehensive about the wedding ritual. It is essentially a woman's initiation rite in which a man is bound to feel like anything but a conquering hero. No wonder we find in tribal societies such counterphobic rituals as the abduction or rape of the bride. These enable the man to cling to the remnants of his heroic role at the very moment that he must submit to his bride and assume the responsibilities of marriage. But the theme of marriage is an image of such universality that it also has a deeper meaning. It is an acceptable, even necessary, symbolic discovery of the feminine component of a man's own psyche, just as much as it is the acquisition of a real wife. So one may encounter this archetype in a man of any age in response to a suitable stimulus. Not all women, however, react trustingly to the married state. A woman patient who had unfulfilled longings for a career, which she had had to give up for a very difficult and short-lived marriage, dreamed that she was kneeling opposite a man who was also kneeling. He had a ring that he prepared to put on her finger, but she stretched out her right-hand ring finger in a tense manner, evidently resisting this ritual of marital union. It was easy to point out her significant error. Instead of offering the left-hand ring finger, by which she could accept a balanced and natural relation to the masculine principle, she had wrongly assumed that she had to put her entire conscious, that is, right-sided identity in the service of the man. In fact, marriage required her to share with him only that subliminal, natural, that is, left-handed part of herself, in which the principle of union would have a symbolic, not a literal or absolute meaning. Her fear was the fear of the woman who dreads to lose her identity in a strongly patriarchal marriage, which this woman had good reason to resist. Nevertheless, the sacred marriage, as an archetypal form, has a particularly important meaning for the psychology of women, and one for which they are prepared during their adolescence by many preliminary events of an initiatory character. Beauty and the Beast. Girls in our society share in the masculine hero myths because, like boys, they must also develop a reliable ego identity and acquire an education. But there is an older layer of the mind that seems to come to the surface in their feelings, with the aim of making them into women, not into imitation men. When this ancient content of the psyche begins to make its appearance, the modern young woman may repress it because it threatens to cut her off from the emancipated equality of friendship and opportunity to compete with men that have become her modern privileges. This repression may be so successful that for a time she will maintain an identification with the masculine intellectual goals she learned at school or college. Even when she marries, she will preserve some illusion of freedom despite her ostensible act of submission to the archetype of marriage, with its implicit injunction to become a mother. And so there may occur, as we very frequently see today, that conflict which in the end forces the woman to rediscover her buried womanhood in a painful but ultimately rewarding manner. I saw an example of this in a young married woman who did not yet have any children, but who intended to have one or two eventually, because it would be expected of her. Meanwhile, her sexual response was unsatisfactory. This worried her and her husband, though they were unable to offer any explanation for it. She had graduated with honors from a good women's college and enjoyed a life of intellectual companionship with her husband and other men. Although this side of her life went well enough much of the time, she had occasional outbursts of temper and talked in an aggressive fashion that alienated men and gave her an intolerable feeling of dissatisfaction with herself. She had a dream at this time that seemed so important she sought professional advice to understand it. She dreamed she was in a line of young women like herself, and as she looked ahead to where they were going, she saw that as each came to the head of the line, she was decapitated by a guillotine. Without any fear, the dreamer remained in the line, presumably quite willing to submit to the same treatment when her turn came. I explained to her that this meant she was ready to give up the habit of living in her head. She must learn to free her body to discover its natural sexual response and the fulfillment of its biological role in motherhood. The dream expressed this as the need to make a drastic change. She had to sacrifice the masculine hero role. As one might expect, this educated woman had no difficulty in accepting this interpretation at an intellectual level, and she set about trying to change herself into a more submissive kind of woman. She did then improve her love life and became the mother of 2 very satisfactory children. As she grew to know herself better, she began to see that for a man, or the masculine-trained mind in women, life is something that has to be taken by storm as an act of the heroic will. But for a woman to feel right about herself, life is best realized by a process of awakening. A universal myth expressing this kind of awakening is found in the fairy tale of Beauty and the Beast. The best-known version of this story relates how Beauty, the youngest of 4 daughters, becomes her father's favorite because of her unselfish goodness. When she asks her father only for a white rose instead of the more costly presents demanded by the others, she is aware only of her inner sincerity of feeling. She does not know that she is about to endanger her father's life and her ideal relation with him, for he steals the white rose from the enchanted garden of Beast, who is stirred to anger by the theft, and requires him to return in 3 months for his punishment, presumably death. In allowing the father this reprieve to go home with his gift, Beast behaves out of character, especially when he also offers to send him a trunk full of gold when he gets home. As Beauty's father comments, the Beast seems cruel and kind at the same time. Beauty insists upon taking her father's punishment and returns after 3 months to the enchanted castle. There she is given a beautiful room where she has no worries and nothing to fear except the occasional visits of Beast, who repeatedly comes to ask her if she will someday marry him. She always refuses. Then, seeing in a magic mirror a picture of her father lying ill, she begs Beast to allow her to return to comfort him, promising to return in a week. Beast tells her that he will die if she deserts him, but she may go for a week. At home, her radiant presence brings joy to her father and envy to her sisters, who plot to detain her longer than her promised stay. At length, she dreams that Beast is dying of despair, so, realizing she has overstayed her time, she returns to resuscitate him. Quite forgetting the dying Beast's ugliness, Beauty ministers to him. He tells her that he was unable to live without her, and that he will die happy now that she is returned. But Beauty realizes that she cannot live without Beast, that she has fallen in love with him. She tells him so and promises to be his wife if only he will not die. At this, the castle is filled with a blaze of light and the sound of music, and Beast disappears. In his place stands a handsome prince, who tells Beauty that he had been enchanted by a witch and turned into the Beast. The spell was ordained to last until a beautiful girl should love Beast for his goodness alone. In this story, if we unravel the symbolism, we are likely to see that Beauty is any young girl or woman who has entered into an emotional bond with her father, no less binding because of its spiritual nature. Her goodness is symbolized by her request for a white rose, but in a significant twist of meaning, her unconscious intention puts her father and then herself in the power of a principle that expresses not goodness alone, but cruelty and kindness combined. It is as if she wished to be rescued from a love holding her to an exclusively virtuous and unreal attitude. By learning to love Beast, she awakens to the power of human love concealed in its animal and therefore imperfect, but genuinely erotic form. Presumably, this represents an awakening of her true function of relatedness, enabling her to accept the erotic component of her original wish, which had to be repressed because of a fear of incest. To leave her father, she had, as it were, to accept the incest fear, to allow herself to live in its presence in fantasy until she could get to know the animal man and discover her own true response to it as a woman. In this way, she redeems herself and her image of the masculine from the forces of repression, bringing to consciousness her capacity to trust her love as something that combines spirit and nature in the best sense of the words. A dream of an emancipated woman patient of mine represented this need to remove the incest fear, a very real fear in this patient's thoughts, because of her father's overclose attachment to her following his wife's death. The dream showed her being chased by a furious bull. She fled at first, but realized it was no use. She fell, and the bull was upon her. She knew her only hope was to sing to the bull, and when she did, though in a quavering voice, the bull calmed down and began licking her hand with its tongue. The interpretation showed that she could now learn to relate to men in a more confidently feminine way, not only sexually, but erotically in the wider sense of relatedness on the level of her conscious identity. But in the cases of older women, the beast theme may not indicate the need to find the answer to a personal fixation or to release a sexual inhibition or any of the things that the psychoanalytically minded rationalist may see in the myth. It can be, in fact, the expression of a certain kind of woman's initiation, which may be just as meaningful at the onset of the menopause as at the height of adolescence, and it may appear at any age when the union of spirit and nature has been disturbed. A woman of menopausal age reported the following dream. I am with several anonymous women whom I don't seem to know. We go downstairs in a strange house and are confronted suddenly by some grotesque ape men with evil faces, dressed in fur, with gray and black rings, with tails, horrible and leering. We are completely in their power, but suddenly I feel the only way we can save ourselves is not to panic and run or fight, but to treat these creatures with humanity, as if to make them aware of their better side. So one of the ape men comes up to me, and I greet him like a dancing partner and begin to dance with him. Later, I have been given supernatural healing powers, and there is a man who is at death's door. I have a kind of quill, or perhaps a bird's beak, through which I blow air into his nostrils, and he begins to breathe again. During the years of her marriage and the raising of her children, this woman had been obliged to neglect her creative gift, with which she had once made a small but genuine reputation as a writer. At the time of her dream, she had been trying to force herself back to work again, at the same time criticizing herself unmercifully for not being a better wife, friend, and mother. The dream showed her problem in the light of other women who might be going through a similar transition, descending, as the dream puts it, into the lower regions of a strange house from a too highly conscious level. This we can guess to be the entrance to some meaningful aspect of the collective unconscious, with its challenge to accept the masculine principle as animal man, that same heroic, clown-like trickster figure we met at the beginning of the primitive hero cycles. For her to relate to this ape man and humanize him by bringing out what is good in him meant that she would first have to accept some unpredictable element of her natural creative spirit. With this, she could cut across the conventional bonds of her life and learn to write in a new way, more appropriate for her in the second part of life. That this impulse is related to the creative masculine principle is shown in the second scene, where she resuscitates a man by blowing air through a kind of bird's beak into his nose. This pneumatic procedure suggests the need for a revival of the spirit, rather than the principle of erotic warmth. It is a symbolism known all over the world. The ritual act brings the creative breath of life to any new achievement. The dream of another woman emphasizes the nature aspect of Beauty and the Beast. Something flies or is thrown in through the window, like a large insect with whirling spiral legs, yellow and black. It then becomes a queer animal, striped yellow and black like a tiger, with bear-like, almost human paws and a pointed wolf-like face. It may run loose and harm children. It is Sunday afternoon, and I see a little girl all dressed in white on her way to Sunday school. I must get the police to help. But then I see the creature has become part woman, part animal. It fawns upon me, wants to be loved. I feel it's a fairy tale situation or a dream, and only kindness can transform it. I try to embrace it warmly, but I can't go through with it. I push it away. But I have the feeling I must keep it near and get used to it, and maybe someday I'll be able to kiss it. Here we have a different situation from the previous one. This woman had been too intensively carried away by the masculine creative function within herself, which had become a compulsive, mental, that is, airborne preoccupation. Thus, she has been prevented from discharging her feminine, wifely function in a natural way. In association to this dream, she said, "When my husband comes home, my creative side goes underground, and I become the over-organized housewife." Her dream takes this unexpected turn of transforming her spirit gone bad into the woman she must accept and cultivate in herself. In this way, she can harmonize her creative intellectual interests with the instincts that enable her to relate warmly to others. This involves a new acceptance of the dual principle of life in nature, of that which is cruel but kind, or, as we might say in her case, ruthlessly adventurous, but at the same time humbly and creatively domestic. These opposites obviously cannot be reconciled except on a highly sophisticated psychological level of awareness, and would of course be harmful to that innocent child in her Sunday school dress. The interpretation one could place on this woman's dream is that she needed to overcome some excessively naive image of herself. She had to be willing to embrace the full polarity of her feelings, just as Beauty had to give up the innocence of trusting in a father who could not give her the pure white rose of his feeling without awakening the beneficent fury of the beast. Orpheus and the Son of Man. Beauty and the Beast is a fairy tale with the quality of a wildflower, appearing so unexpectedly and creating in us such a natural sense of wonder that we do not notice for the moment that it belongs to a definite class, genus, and species of plant. The kind of mystery inherent in such a story is given a universal application not only in a larger historical myth, but also in the rituals whereby the myth is expressed or from which it may be derived. The type of ritual and myth appropriately expressing this type of psychological experience is exemplified in the Greco-Roman religion of Dionysus, and in its successor, the religion of Orpheus. Both of these religions provided a significant initiation of the type known as mysteries. They brought forth symbols associated with a god-man of androgynous character who was supposed to have an intimate understanding of the animal or plant world and to be the master of initiation into their secrets. The Dionysiac religion contained orgiastic rites that implied the need for an initiate to abandon himself to his animal nature and thereby experience the full fertilizing power of the Earth Mother. The initiating agent for this rite of passage in the Dionysiac ritual was wine. It was supposed to produce the symbolic lowering of consciousness necessary to introduce the novice into the closely guarded secrets of nature, whose essence was expressed by a symbol of erotic fulfillment, the god Dionysus joined with Ariadne, his consort, in a sacred marriage ceremony. In time, the rites of Dionysus lost their emotive religious power. There emerged an almost oriental longing for liberation from their exclusive preoccupation with the purely natural symbols of life and love. The Dionysiac religion, shifting constantly from spiritual to physical and back again, perhaps proved too wild and turbulent for some more ascetic souls. These came to experience their religious ecstasies inwardly, in the worship of Orpheus. Orpheus was probably a real man, a singer, prophet, and teacher who was martyred and whose tomb became a shrine. No wonder the early Christian church saw in Orpheus the prototype of Christ. Both religions brought to the late Hellenistic world the promise of a future divine life. Because they were men, yet also mediators of the divine, for the multitudes of the dying Grecian culture in the days of the Roman Empire, they held the longed-for hope of a future life. There was, however, one important difference between the religion of Orpheus and the religion of Christ. Though sublimated into a mystical form, the Orphic mysteries kept alive the old Dionysiac religion. The spiritual impetus came from a demigod in whom was preserved the most significant quality of a religion rooted in the art of agriculture. That quality was the old pattern of the fertility gods, who came only for the season, in other words, the eternally recurrent cycle of birth, growth, fullness, and decay. Christianity, on the other hand, dispelled the mysteries. Christ was the product and reformer of a patriarchal, nomadic, pastoral religion whose prophets represented their Messiah as a being of absolutely divine origin. The Son of Man, though born of a human virgin, had his beginning in heaven, whence he came in an act of God's incarnation in man. After his death he returned to heaven, but returned once and for all, to reign on the right hand of God until the second coming, when the dead shall arise. Of course, the asceticism of early Christianity did not last. The memory of the cyclic mysteries haunted its followers to the extent that the Church eventually had to incorporate many practices from the pagan past into its rituals. The most meaningful of these may be found in the old records of what was done on Holy Saturday and Easter Sunday in celebration of the resurrection of Christ, the baptismal service that the medieval Church made into a suitable and deeply meaningful initiation rite. But that ritual has scarcely survived into modern times, and it is completely absent in Protestantism. The ritual that has survived much better, and that still contains the meaning of a central initiation mystery for the devout, is the Catholic practice of the elevation of the chalice. It has been described by Dr. Jung in his Transformation Symbolism in the Mass. The lifting up of the chalice in the air prepares the spiritualization of the wine. This is confirmed by the invocation to the Holy Ghost that immediately follows. The invocation serves to infuse the wine with Holy Spirit, for it is the Holy Ghost who begets, fulfills, and transforms. After the elevation, the chalice was, in former times, set down to the right of the host, to correspond with the blood that flowed from the right side of Christ. The ritual of communion is everywhere the same, whether it is expressed by drinking of the cup of Dionysus or of the holy Christian chalice. But the level of awareness each brings to the individual participant is different. The Dionysiac participant looks back to the origin of things, to the storm birth of the God who is blasted from the resistant womb of Mother Earth. In the frescoes of the Villa dei Misteri in Pompeii, the enacted rite evoked the god as a mask of terror, reflected in the cup of Dionysus offered by the priest to the initiate. Later, we find the winnowing basket, with its precious fruits of the earth, and the phallus as creative symbols of the god's manifestation as the principle of breeding and growth. In contrast to this backward look, with its central focus on nature's eternal cycle of birth and death, the Christian mystery points forward to the initiate's ultimate hope of union with a transcendent God. Mother Nature, with all her beautiful seasonal changes, has been left behind, and the central figure of Christianity offers spiritual certainty, for he is the Son of God in heaven. Yet the two somehow fuse in the figure of Orpheus, the god who remembers Dionysus but looks forward to Christ. The psychological sense of this intermediate figure has been described by the Swiss author Linda Fierz-David in her interpretation of the Orphic rite pictured in the Villa dei Misteri. Orpheus taught while he sang and played the lyre, and his singing was so powerful that it mastered all nature. When he sang to his lyre, the birds flew about him, the fish left the water and sprang to him, the wind and the sea became still, the rivers flowed upward toward him. It did not snow, and there was no hail. Trees and the very stones followed after Orpheus. Tiger and lion lay down near him next to the sheep, and the wolves next to the stag and the roe. Now, what does this mean? It surely means that through a divine insight into the meaning of natural events, nature's happenings become harmoniously ordered from within. Everything becomes light, and all creatures appeased when the mediator, in the act of worshipping, represents the light of nature. Orpheus is an embodiment of devotion and piety. He symbolizes the religious attitude that solves all conflicts, since thereby the whole soul is turned toward that which lies on the other side of all conflict. And as he does this, he is truly Orpheus, that is, a good shepherd, his primitive embodiment. Both as good shepherd and as mediator, Orpheus strikes the balance between the Dionysiac religion and the Christian religion, since we find both Dionysus and Christ in similar roles, though, as I have said, differently oriented as to time and direction in space, one a cyclic religion of the netherworld, the other heavenly and eschatological or final. This series of initiatory events, drawn from the context of religious history, is repeated endlessly and with practically every conceivable individual twist of meaning in the dreams and fantasies of modern people. In a state of heavy fatigue and depression, a woman undergoing analysis had this fantasy. I sit on the side of a long, narrow table in a high vaulted room with no window. My body is hunched over and shrunken. There is nothing over me but a long white linen cloth that hangs from my shoulders to the floor. Something crucial has happened to me. There is not much life left in me. Red crosses on gold discs appear before my eyes. I recall that I have made some sort of commitment a long time ago, and wherever I am now must be part of this. I sit there a long time. Now I slowly open my eyes, and I see a man who sits beside me, who is to heal me. He appears natural and kind, and he is talking to me, though I don't hear him. He seems to know all about where I have been. I am aware that I am very ugly, and that there must be an odor of death around me. I wonder if he will be repelled. I look at him for a very long time. He does not turn away. I breathe more easily. Then I feel a cool breeze or cool water pour over my body. I wrap the white linen cloth across me now and prepare for a natural sleep. The man's healing hands are on my shoulders. I recall vaguely that there was a time when there were wounds there, but the pressure of his hand seems to give me strength and healing. This woman had previously felt threatened by doubts about her original religious affiliation. She had been brought up as a devout Catholic of the old school, but since her youth she had struggled to free herself from the formal religious conventions followed by her family. Yet the symbolic events of the church year and the richness of her insight into their meaning remained with her throughout the process of her psychological change. And in her analysis, I found this working knowledge of religious symbolism most helpful. The significant elements she singled out of her fantasy were the white cloth, which she understood as a sacrificial cloth, the vaulted room, which she considered to be a tomb, and her commitment, which she associated with the experience of submission. This commitment, as she called it, suggested a ritual of initiation with a perilous descent into the vault of death, which symbolized the way she had left church and family to experience God in her own fashion. She had undergone an imitation of Christ in the true symbolic sense, and like him she had suffered the wounds that preceded this death. The sacrificial cloth suggests the winding sheet or shroud in which the crucified Christ was wrapped and then placed in the tomb. The end of the fantasy introduces the healing figure of a man, loosely associated with me as her analyst, but appearing also in his natural role as a friend, fully aware of her experience. He speaks to her in words she cannot yet hear, but his hands are reassuring and give a sense of healing. One senses in this figure the touch and the word of the Good Shepherd, Orpheus or Christ, as mediator, and also, of course, as healer. He is on the side of life, and has to convince her that she may now come back from the vault of death. Shall we call this rebirth or resurrection? Both, perhaps, or neither. The essential rite proclaims itself at the end. The cool breeze or water flowing over her body is the primordial act of purification or cleansing of the sin of death, the essence of true baptism. The same woman had another fantasy in which she felt that her birthday fell upon the day of Christ's resurrection. This was much more meaningful for her than the memory of her mother, who had never given her the feeling of reassurance and renewal she so much wished for on her childhood birthdays. But this did not mean she identified herself with the figure of Christ. For all his power and glory, something was lacking, and as she tried to reach him through prayer, he and his cross were lifted up to heaven out of her human reach. In this second fantasy, she fell back upon the symbol of rebirth as a rising sun, and a new feminine symbol began to make its appearance. First of all, it appeared as an embryo in a watery sack. Then she was carrying an 8-year-old boy through the water, passing a danger point. Then a new movement occurred in which she no longer felt threatened or under the influence of death. She was in a forest by a little spring waterfall. Green vines grow all around. In my hands I have a stone bowl in which there is spring water, some green moss, and violets. I bathe myself under the waterfall. It is golden and silky, and I feel like a child. The sense of these events is clear, though it is possible to miss the inner meaning in the cryptic description of so many changing images. Here we have, it seems, a process of rebirth, in which a larger spiritual self is reborn and baptized in nature as a child. Meanwhile, she has rescued an older child who was in some way her own ego at the most traumatic period of her childhood. She then carried it through water past the danger point, thus indicating her fear of a paralyzing sense of guilt if she should depart too far from her family's conventional religion. But religious symbolism is significant by its absence. All is in the hands of nature. We are clearly in the realm of the shepherd Orpheus, rather than the risen Christ. A dream followed this sequence, which brought her to a church resembling the church in Assisi with Giotto's frescoes of St. Francis. She felt more at home here than she would in other churches, because St. Francis, like Orpheus, was a religious man of nature. This revived her feelings about the change in her religious affiliation that had been so painful to undergo, but now she believed she could joyfully face the experience, inspired by the light of nature. The series of dreams ended with a distant echo of the religion of Dionysus. One could say that this was a reminder that even Orpheus can at times be a little too far removed from the fecundating power of the animal god in man. She dreamed that she was leading a fair-haired child by the hand. We are happily participating in a festival that includes the sun and the forests and flowers all around. The child has a little white flower in her hand, and she places it on the head of a black bull. The bull is part of the festival and is covered with festive decorations. This reference recalls the ancient rites that celebrated Dionysus in the guise of a bull. But the dream did not end there. The woman added, "Sometime later, the bull is pierced by a golden arrow." Now, besides Dionysus, there is another pre-Christian rite in which the bull plays a symbolic role. The Persian sun god Mithras sacrifices a bull. He, like Orpheus, represents the longing for a life of the spirit that might triumph over the primitive animal passions of man, and, after a ceremony of initiation, give him peace. This series of images confirms a suggestion that is found in many fantasy or dream sequences of this type, that there is no final peace, no resting point. In their religious quest, men and women, especially those who live in modern Western Christianized societies, are still in the power of those early traditions that strive within them for supremacy. It is a conflict of pagan or Christian beliefs, or, one might say, of rebirth or resurrection. End of side 4. Change side selector switch. This book is continued on the next cassette. Side 5. Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung. Continuing with Ancient Myths and Modern Man on page 148. A more direct clue to the solution of this dilemma is to be found in this woman's first fantasy in a curious piece of symbolism that could easily be overlooked. The woman says that in her death vault she saw before her eyes a vision of red crosses on gold discs. As became clear later in her analysis, she was about to experience a profound psychic change and to emerge out of this death into a new kind of life. We might imagine, therefore, that this image, which came to her in the depth of her despair of life, should in some way herald her future religious attitude. In her subsequent work, she did in fact produce evidence for thinking that the red crosses represented her devotion to the Christian attitude, while the gold discs represented her devotion to the pre-Christian mystery religions. Her vision had told her that she must reconcile these Christian and pagan elements in the new life that lay ahead. One last but important observation concerns the ancient initiation rites and their relation to Christianity. The initiation rite celebrated in the Eleusinian Mysteries, the rites of worship of the fertility goddesses Demeter and Persephone, was not considered appropriate merely for those who sought to live life more abundantly. It was also used as a preparation for death, as if death also required an initiatory rite of passage of the same kind. On a funeral urn found in a Roman grave near the Columbarium on the Esquiline Hill, we find a clear bas-relief representing scenes of the final stage of initiation, where the novice is admitted to the presence and converse of the goddesses. The rest of the design is devoted to two preliminary ceremonies of purification, the sacrifice of the mystic pig and a mysticized version of the sacred marriage. This all points to an initiation into death, but in a form that lacks the finality of mourning. It hints at that element of the later mysteries, especially of Orphism, which makes death carry a promise of immortality. Christianity went even further. It promised something more than immortality, which in the old sense of the cyclic mysteries might merely mean reincarnation, for it offered the faithful an everlasting life in heaven. So we see again, in modern life, the tendency to repeat old patterns. Those who have to learn to face death may have to relearn the old message that tells us that death is a mystery for which we must prepare ourselves in the same spirit of submission and humility as we once learned to prepare ourselves for life. Symbols of transcendence. The symbols that influence man vary in their purpose. Some men need to be aroused and experience their initiation in the violence of a Dionysiac thunder rite. Others need to be subdued, and they are brought to submission in the ordered design of temple precinct or sacred cave, suggestive of the Apollonian religion of later Greece. A full initiation embraces both themes, as we can see when we look either at the material drawn from ancient texts or at living subjects. But it is quite certain that the fundamental goal of initiation lies in taming the original trickster-like wildness of the juvenile nature. It therefore has a civilizing or spiritualizing purpose, in spite of the violence of the rites that are required to set this process in motion. There is, however, another kind of symbolism, belonging to the earliest known sacred traditions, that is also connected with the periods of transition in a person's life. But these symbols do not seek to integrate the initiate with any religious doctrine or secular group consciousness. On the contrary, they point to man's need for liberation from any state of being that is too immature, too fixed, or final. In other words, they concern man's release from, or transcendence of, any confining pattern of existence as he moves toward a superior or more mature stage in his development. A child, as I have said, possesses a sense of completeness, but only before the initial emergence of his ego consciousness. In the case of an adult, a sense of completeness is achieved through a union of the consciousness with the unconscious contents of the mind. Out of this union arises what Jung called the transcendent function of the psyche, by which a man can achieve his highest goal, the full realization of the potential of his individual self. Thus, what we call symbols of transcendence are the symbols that represent man's striving to attain this goal. They provide the means by which the contents of the unconscious can enter the conscious mind, and they also are themselves an active expression of those contents. These symbols are manifold in form. Whether we encounter them in history or in the dreams of contemporary men and women who are at a critical stage in their lives, we can see their importance. At the most archaic level of this symbolism, we again meet the trickster theme. But this time, he no longer appears as a lawless would-be hero. He has become the shaman, the medicine man, whose magical practices and flights of intuition stamp him as a primitive master of initiation. His power resides in his supposed ability to leave his body and fly about the universe as a bird. In this case, the bird is the most fitting symbol of transcendence. It represents the peculiar nature of intuition working through a medium, that is, an individual who is capable of obtaining knowledge of distant events or facts of which he consciously knows nothing by going into a trance-like state. Evidence of such powers can be found as far back as the Paleolithic period of prehistory, as the American scholar Joseph Campbell has pointed out in commenting upon one of the famous cave paintings recently discovered in France. At Lascaux, he writes, there is a shaman depicted lying in a trance, wearing a bird mask with a figure of a bird perched on a staff beside him. The shamans of Siberia wear such bird costumes to this day, and many are believed to have been conceived by their mothers from the descent of a bird. The shaman, then, is not only a familiar denizen, but even the favored scion of those realms of power that are invisible to our normal waking consciousness, which all may visit briefly in a vision, but through which he roams a master. At the highest level of this type of initiatory activity, far from those tricks of the trade by which magic so frequently replaces true spiritual insight, we find the Hindu master yogis. In their trance states, they go far beyond the normal categories of thought. One of the commonest dream symbols for this type of release through transcendence is the theme of the lonely journey or pilgrimage, which somehow seems to be a spiritual pilgrimage, on which the initiate becomes acquainted with the nature of death. But this is not death as a last judgment or other initiatory trial of strength. It is a journey of release, renunciation, and atonement, presided over and fostered by some spirit of compassion. This spirit is more often represented by a mistress rather than a master of initiation, a supreme feminine, that is, anima figure, such as Kuan Yin in Chinese Buddhism, Sophia in the Christian Gnostic doctrine, or the ancient Greek goddess of wisdom, Pallas Athena. Not only the flight of birds or the journey into the wilderness represents this symbolism, but any strong movement exemplifying release. In the first part of life, when one is still attached to the original family and social group, this may be experienced as that moment of initiation at which one must learn to take the decisive steps into life alone. It is the moment that T.S. Eliot describes in The Wasteland, when one faces the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. At a later period of life, one may not need to break all ties with the symbols of meaningful containment, but nonetheless one can be filled with that spirit of divine discontent which forces all free men to face some new discovery or to live their lives in a new way. This change may become especially important in the period between middle age and old age, which is the time in life when so many people are considering what to do in their retirement, whether to work or to play, whether to stay at home or to travel. If their lives have been adventurous, insecure, or full of change, they may long for a settled life and the consolations of religious certainty. But if they have lived chiefly within the social pattern in which they were born, they may desperately need a liberating change. This need may be filled temporarily by a trip around the world, or by nothing more than a move to a smaller house. But none of these external changes will serve unless there has been some inner transcendence of old values in creating, not just inventing, a new pattern of life. A case of this latter sort is a woman who had lived in a style of life that she, her family, and friends had long enjoyed because it was so well-rooted, culturally nourishing, and secure from transitory fashions. She had this dream. I found some strange pieces of wood, not carved, but with natural, beautiful shapes. Someone said, Neanderthal man brought them. Then I saw at a distance these Neanderthal men, looking like a dark mass, but I could not see one of them distinctly. I thought I would take back from this place a piece of their wood. Then I went on, as if on a journey by myself, and I looked down into an enormous abyss, like an extinct volcano. There was water in part of it, and there I expected to see more Neanderthal men, but instead I saw black water pigs that had come out of the water and were running in and out of the black volcanic rocks. In contrast to this woman's family attachments and her highly cultivated style of life, the dream takes her to a prehistoric period more primitive than anything we can visualize. She can find no social group among these ancient men. She sees them as an embodiment of a truly unconscious, collective dark mass in the distance. Yet they are alive, and she may carry away a piece of their wood. The dream emphasizes that the wood is natural, not carved. Therefore, it comes from a primordial, not a culturally conditioned level of the unconscious. The piece of wood, remarkable for its great age, links this woman's contemporary experience to the distant origins of human life. We know from many examples that an ancient tree or plant represents symbolically the growth and development of psychic life, as distinct from instinctual life, commonly symbolized by animals. Hence, in this piece of wood, this woman acquired a symbol of her link with the deepest layers of the collective unconscious. Next, she speaks of continuing her journey alone. This theme, as I have already pointed out, symbolizes the need for release as an initiatory experience. So here we have another symbol of transcendence. Then, in the dream, she sees a huge crater of an extinct volcano, which has been the channel for a violent eruption of fire from the deepest layers of the earth. We can surmise that this refers to a significant memory trace, which leads back to a traumatic experience. This she associated to a personal experience early in her life when she had felt the destructive yet creative force of her passions to such an extent that she feared she would go out of her mind. She had found in late adolescence a quite unexpected need to break away from her family's excessively conventional social pattern. She had achieved this break without serious distress and had been able to return eventually to make her peace with the family. But there lingered a profound wish to make a still greater differentiation from her family background and to find freedom from her own pattern of existence. This dream recalls another. It came from a young man who had a totally different problem, but who seemed to need a similar type of insight. He, too, had the urge to achieve differentiation. He dreamed of a volcano, and from its crater he saw two birds taking flight, as if in fear that the volcano was about to erupt. This was in a strange, lonely place, with a body of water between him and the volcano. In this case, the dream represented an individual initiation journey. It is similar to cases reported among the simple food-gathering tribes, which are the least family-conscious groups we know. In these societies, the young initiate must take a lonely journey to a sacred place. In Indian cultures of the North Pacific coast, it may actually be a crater lake, where, in a visionary or trance-like state, he encounters his guardian spirit in the form of an animal, a bird, or a natural object. He closely identifies himself with this bush soul and thereby becomes a man. Without such an experience, he is regarded, as an Achumawi medicine man put it, as an ordinary Indian, nobody. The young man's dream came at the beginning of his life, and it pointed to his future independence and identity as a man. The woman I have described was approaching the end of her life, and she experienced a similar journey and seemed to need to acquire a similar independence. She could live out the remainder of her days in harmony with an eternal human law that by its antiquity transcended the known symbols of culture. But such independence does not end in a state of yogi-like detachment that would mean a renunciation of the world with all its impurities. In the otherwise dead and blasted landscape of her dream, the woman saw signs of animal life. These are water pigs, unknown to her as a species. They therefore would carry the meaning of a special type of animal, one that can live in two environments, in water or on the earth. This is the universal quality of the animal as a symbol of transcendence. These creatures, figuratively coming from the depths of the ancient Earth Mother, are symbolic denizens of the collective unconscious. They bring into the field of consciousness a special thonic, underworld message that is somewhat different from the spiritual aspirations symbolized by the birds in the young man's dream. Other transcendent symbols of the depths are rodents, lizards, snakes, and sometimes fish. These are intermediate creatures that combine underwater activity and the bird flight with an intermediate terrestrial life. The wild duck or the swan are cases in point. Perhaps the commonest dream symbol of transcendence is the snake, as represented by the therapeutic symbol of the Roman god of medicine, Aesculapius, which has survived to modern times as a sign of the medical profession. This was originally a non-poisonous tree snake. As we see it, coiled around the staff of the healing god, it seems to embody a kind of mediation between earth and heaven. A still more important and widespread symbol of chthonic transcendence is the motif of the two entwined serpents. These are the famous Naga serpents of ancient India, and we also find them in Greece as the entwined serpents on the end of the staff belonging to the god Hermes. An early Grecian herm is a stone pillar with a bust of the god above. On one side are the entwined serpents, and on the other an erect phallus. As the serpents are represented in the act of sexual union, and the erect phallus is unequivocally sexual, we can draw certain conclusions about the function of the herm as a symbol of fertility. But we are mistaken if we think this only refers to biological fertility. Hermes is trickster in a different role as a messenger, a god of the crossroads, and finally the leader of souls to and from the underworld. His phallus, therefore, penetrates from the known into the unknown world, seeking a spiritual message of deliverance and healing. Originally, in Egypt, Hermes was known as the ibis-headed god Thoth, and therefore was conceived as the bird form of the transcendent principle. Again, in the Olympian period of Greek mythology, Hermes recovered attributes of the bird life to add to his sonic nature as serpent. His staff acquired wings above the serpents, becoming the caduceus, or winged staff of Mercury, and the god himself became the flying man, with his winged hat and sandals. Here we see his full power of transcendence, whereby the lower transcendence from underworld snake consciousness, passing through the medium of earthly reality, finally attains transcendence to superhuman or transpersonal reality in its winged flight. Such a composite symbol is found in other representations as the winged horse or winged dragon, or other creatures that abound in the artistic expressions of alchemy, so fully illustrated in Dr. Jung's classic work on this subject. We follow the innumerable vicissitudes of these symbols in our work with patients. They show what our therapy can expect to achieve when it liberates the deeper psychic contents so that they can become part of our conscious equipment for understanding life more effectively. It is not easy for modern man to grasp the significance of the symbols that come down to us from the past or that appear in our dreams, nor is it easy to see how the ancient conflict between symbols of containment and liberation relates to our own predicament. Yet it becomes easier when we realize it is only the specific forms of these archaic patterns that change, not their psychic meaning. We have been talking of wild birds as symbols of release or liberation. But today we could as well speak of jet planes and space rockets, for they are the physical embodiment of the same transcendent principle, freeing us, at least temporarily, from gravity. In the same way, the ancient symbols of containment, which once gave stability and protection, now appear in modern man's search for economic security and social welfare. Any of us can see, of course, that there is a conflict in our lives between adventure and discipline, or evil and virtue, or freedom and security. But these are only phrases we use to describe an ambivalence that troubles us, and to which we never seem able to find an answer. There is an answer. There is a meeting point between containment and liberation, and we can find it in the rites of initiation that I have been discussing. They can make it possible for individuals or whole groups of people to unite the opposing forces within themselves and achieve an equilibrium in their lives. But the rites do not offer this opportunity invariably or automatically. They relate to particular phases of life of an individual or of a group, and unless they are properly understood and translated into a new way of life, the moment can pass. Initiation is essentially a process that begins with a rite of submission, followed by a period of containment, and then by a further rite of liberation. In this way, every individual can reconcile the conflicting elements of his personality. He can strike a balance that makes him truly human and truly the master of himself. Photo captions. A ceremonial mask from the island of New Ireland, New Guinea. Far left. A symbolic ceremony of antiquity in 20th century form. The American astronaut John Glenn in a Washington parade after his orbit of the Earth in 1962. Like a hero of old after a victory, returning home in a triumphal procession. Center left. A cross-like sculpture of a Greek fertility goddess, circa 2500 BC. Left. Two views of a 12th century Scots stone cross that retains some pagan femaleness, the breasts at the crossbar. Right. Another age-old archetype reborn in a new guise. a Russian poster for an atheistic festival at Easter to replace the Christian festival, just as the Christian Easter was superimposed on earlier pagan solstice rites. Left, a 13th century Japanese scroll painting of the destruction of a city. Below, similarly dominated by flame and smoke, St. Paul's Cathedral, London, during an air raid in World War II. Methods of warfare have changed over the ages, but the emotional impact of war is timeless and archetypal. Top left, Christ's Nativity. Center, his crucifixion. Bottom, his ascension. His birth, death, and rebirth follows the pattern of many ancient hero myths, a pattern originally based on seasonal fertility rites, like those probably held 3,000 years ago at England's Stonehenge, seen below at dawn at the summer solstice. The hero's early proof of strength occurs in most hero myths. Below, the infant Hercules killing 2 serpents. Top right, the young King Arthur, alone able to draw a magic sword from a stone. Bottom right, America's Davy Crockett, who killed a bear when he was 3. Above, 3 examples of the tutelary or guardian figure that accompanies the archetypal hero. Top, from Greek myth, the centaur Chiron, giving instruction to the youthful Achilles. Center, King Arthur's guardian, the magician Merlin, holding a scroll. Bottom, an instance from modern life, a trainer on whose knowledge and experience a professional boxer often depends. Most heroes must face and overcome various monsters and forces of evil. Top, the Scandinavian hero Sigurd, lower right of picture, slays the serpent Fafnir. Center, the ancient Babylonian epic hero Gilgamesh, battling with a lion. Bottom, the modern American comic strip hero Superman, whose one-man war against crime often requires him to rescue pretty girls. Above, 2 examples of the hero's betrayal. The biblical hero Samson, top, betrayed by Delilah, and the Persian hero Rustam, led into a trap by a man he trusted. Below, a modern result of hubris, overconfidence. German prisoners in Stalingrad, 1941, after Hitler invaded Russia in winter. Trickster, the first rudimentary stage in the development of the hero myth, in which the hero is instinctual, uninhibited, and often childish. Far left, the 16th century Chinese epic hero Monkey, shown in a modern Peking opera, tricking a river king into giving up a magic staff. Left, on a 6th century BC jar, the infant Hermes in his cradle after having stolen Apollo's cattle. Right, the troublemaking Norse god Loki, a 19th century sculpture. Far right, Charlie Chaplin creating a disturbance in the 1936 film Modern Times, a 20th century trickster. The second stage in the evolution of the hero is the founder of human culture. Left, a Navajo sand painting of the myth of Coyote, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to man. In Greek myth, Prometheus also stole fire from the gods for man, for which he was chained to a rock and tortured by an eagle, below on a 6th century BC cup. The hero in the 3rd stage is a powerful man-god, like Buddha. In the 1st century sculpture above, Siddhartha begins the journey on which he will receive enlightenment and become Buddha. Below left, a medieval Italian sculpture of Romulus and Remus, the twins raised by a wolf who founded Rome, and who are the best-known instance of the 4th stage of the hero myth. In the 4th stage, the twins often misused their power, as did the Roman heroes Castor and Pollux when they abducted the daughters of Leucippus, below in a painting by the Flemish artist Rubens. An individual psyche develops, as does the hero myth, from a primitive childish stage, and often images of the early stages can appear in the dreams of psychologically immature adults. The 1st stage might be represented by the carefree play of children, like the pillow fight, far left, from the 1933 French film Zéro de Conduite. The 2nd stage might be the reckless thrill-seeking of early adolescence. Right, American youths test their nerves in a speeding car. A later stage can produce idealism and self-sacrifice in late adolescence, exemplified in the picture opposite, far right, taken during the East Berlin Rising, June 1953, when young men fought Russian tanks with stones. The young, undifferentiated ego personality is protected by the mother, a protection imaged by the sheltering Madonna, left, in a painting by the 15th century Italian artist Piero della Francesca, or by the Egyptian sky goddess Nut, right, bending over the earth, in a 5th century BC relief. But the ego must eventually free itself from unconsciousness and immaturity, and its battle for deliverance is often symbolized by a hero's battle with a monster, like the Japanese god Susanu's battle with a serpent, top right, in a 19th century print. The hero doesn't always win at once. For instance, Jonah was swallowed by the whale, far right, from a 14th century manuscript. The ego's emergence can be symbolized not by a battle, but by a sacrifice, death leading to rebirth. Revolution is sacrificial in this way. Delacroix's painting, below, Greece expiring on the ruins of Missolonghi, personifies the country killed by civil war to be liberated and reborn, as individual sacrifices. The British poet Byron, above, died in Greece during the Revolution, 1824. Below left, the Christian martyr St. Lucia sacrificed her eyes and her life for her religion. Below, a montage of World War I, a call to arms poster, infantry, a military cemetery. Memorials and religious services for soldiers who gave their lives for their country often reflect the cyclic death and rebirth theme of the archetypal heroic sacrifice. An inscription on one British memorial to the dead of World War I reads, "At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them." In mythology, a hero's death is often due to his own hubris, which causes the gods to humble him. As a modern example, in 1912, the ship Titanic struck an iceberg and sank. Right, a montage of scenes of the sinking from the 1943 film Titanic. Yet the Titanic had been called unsinkable. According to the American author Walter Lord, one sailor was heard to say, "God himself couldn't sink this ship." Heroes often fight monsters to rescue damsels in distress, who symbolize the anima. Left, St. George slays a dragon to free a maiden, in a 15th century Italian painting. Right, in the 1916 film The Great Secret, the dragon has become a locomotive, but the heroic rescue remains the same. Some heroic battles and rescues from Greek myth. Far left, Perseus slays Medusa on a 6th century BC vase. Left, Perseus with Andromeda, from a 1st century BC mural, whom he saved from a monster. Right, Theseus kills the Minotaur, on a 1st century BC jar, watched by Ariadne. Below, on a Cretan coin, 67 BC, the Minotaur's labyrinth. The hero's rescue of a maiden can symbolize the freeing of the anima from the devouring aspect of the mother. This aspect is represented, far left, by Balinese dancers wearing the mask of Rangda, left, a malign female spirit, or by the serpent that swallowed and then regurgitated the Greek hero Jason, above. As in the dream discussed in this chapter, a common anima symbol is a harbor town. Below, a poster by Marc Chagall personifies Nice as a mermaid. A primitive tribe's totem, often an animal, symbolizes each tribesman's identity with the tribal unit. Left, an Australian aborigine imitating, in a ritual dance, his tribe's totem, an emu. Many modern groups use totem-like animals as emblems. Below, a heraldic lion from the Belgian coat of arms on a 17th century allegorical map of Belgium. Right, the falcon is the mascot of the American Air Force Academy's football team. Far right, modern totemistic emblems that aren't animals. A shop window display of ties, badges, etc., of British schools and clubs. Primitive initiation rituals bring the youth into adulthood and into the tribe's collective identity. In many primitive societies, initiation is accomplished by circumcision, a symbolic sacrifice. Here are 4 stages in a circumcision rite of Australian Aborigines: far left, top, and center. The boys are placed under blankets, a symbolic death from which they will be reborn. Bottom, they are removed and held by the men for the actual operation. Left, the circumcised boys are given men's conical caps, a mark of their new status. Right, they are finally isolated from the tribe to be purified and given instruction. A sarcophagus from 2nd century A.D. Thebes that reveals a symbolic connection with the archetypal Great Mother, the container of all life. The inside of the cover bears a portrait of the Egyptian goddess Nut. Thus the goddess would embrace the body of the deceased, whose portrait is on the base, far right. 4 varied initiation ceremonies. Top left, novices in a convent perform such humble duties as scrubbing a floor, from the 1958 film The Nun's Story, and have their hair cut off, from a medieval painting. Center, ship's passengers crossing the equator must undergo a rite of passage. Bottom, American college freshmen in a traditional battle with their seniors. Marriage can be seen as an initiation rite in which the man and the woman must submit to one another. But in some societies the man offsets his submission by ritually abducting his bride, as to the Dayaks of Malaysia and Borneo. Right, from the 1955 film The Lost Continent. A remnant of this practice exists in today's custom of carrying the bride across the threshold, far right. The archetypal sacred marriage, the union of opposites, of the male and female principles, represented here by a 19th century Indian sculpture of the deities Shiva and Parvati. 3 scenes from the 1946 film of Beauty and the Beast, directed by Francis Jean Cocteau. Left, Beauty's father caught stealing the white rose from the beast's garden. Right, the beast dying. Far right, the beast transformed into a prince walking with Beauty. The story can be said to symbolize a young girl's initiation, that is, her release from her bond with her father in order to come to terms with the erotic animal side of her nature. Until this is done, she cannot achieve a true relationship with a man. Above, the Greek god Dionysus ecstatically playing the lute in a vase painting. The frenzied and orgiastic rites of the Dionysiac cults symbolized initiation into nature's mysteries. Right, Maenads worshipping Dionysus. Far right, satyrs in the same wild worship. Above, a Dionysiac ritual depicted on the great fresco in the Villa of the Mysteries at Pompeii. In the center, an initiate is offered the ceremonial cup of Dionysus, in which he sees a reflection of the god mask held behind. This is a symbolic infusion of the drink with the god's spirit, which can be said to parallel the Roman Catholic ceremony of elevating the chalice during Mass, below. Left, Orpheus charming the beasts with his song, in a Roman mosaic. Above, the murder of Orpheus by Thracian women on a Greek vase. Below left, Christ as the Good Shepherd, a 6th century mosaic. Both Orpheus and Christ parallel the archetype of the man of nature, also reflected in the painting by Cranach, below, of natural man's innocence. Facing page, left, the 18th century French philosopher Rousseau, who put forward the idea of the noble savage, the simple child of nature, free of sin and evil. Far right, the title page of Walden, by the 19th century American writer Thoreau, who believed in and followed a natural way of life almost wholly independent of civilization. Above left, the Persian god Mithras sacrificing the bull. The sacrifice, also part of Dionysiac rites, can be seen as a symbol of the victory of man's spiritual nature over his animality, of which the bull is a common symbol. This may explain the popularity in some countries of bullfighting. Left. Right. An etching by Picasso, 1935, depicts a girl threatened by a minotaur. Here, as in the myth of Theseus, a symbol of man's uncontrollable instinctive forces. Both a bird and a shaman, that is, a primitive medicine man, are common symbols of transcendence, and often are combined. Left, a prehistoric cave painting at Lascaux, shows a shaman in a bird mask. Below, a shaman priestess of a Siberian people in a bird costume. Right, a shaman's coffin, also Siberian, with bird figures on the posts. In myths or dreams, a lonely journey often symbolizes the liberation of transcendence. Above left, a 15th century painting of the poet Dante holding his book, The Divine Comedy, which relates his dream of a journey to hell, lower left of picture, purgatory, and heaven. Far left, an engraving of the journey made by the pilgrim in the British author John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, 1678. Note that the journey is a circular movement toward an inner center. This book, too, is told as a dream. Left, the pilgrim dreaming. Many people want some change from a containing pattern of life, but the freedom gained by travel, urged by the runaway to sea poster, right, is no substitute for a true inner liberation. Left, the British explorer R.F. Scott and his companions, photographed in the Antarctic in 1911. Explorers, venturing into the unknown, provide an apt image of the liberation, the breaking out of containment that characterizes transcendence. The symbol of the snake is commonly linked with transcendence because it was traditionally a creature of the underworld and thus was a mediator between one way of life and another. Right, the snake and staff symbol of the Greco-Roman god of medicine, Asclepius, on a card used to identify a doctor's car in modern France. Left, a 17th century French painting reveals the snake's role as mediator between this world and the next. Orpheus is playing his lyre. He and his audience fail to notice that Eurydice, center of picture, has been bitten by a snake, a fatal wound that symbolizes her descent into the underworld. Above, the Egyptian god Thoth, with the head of a bird, an ibis, in a relief from circa 350 B.C. Thoth is an underworld figure associated with transcendence. It was he who judged the souls of the dead. The Greek god Hermes, who was called Psychopomp, soul guide, had the function of guiding the dead to the underworld. Left, a stone herm, which was placed at crossroads, symbolizing the god's role as a mediator between two worlds. On the side of the herm is a snake twined around a staff. This symbol, the caduceus, was carried over to the Roman god Mercury, right, a 16th century Italian bronze, who also acquired wings, recalling the bird as a symbol of spiritual transcendence. Winged dragons, above, from a 15th century manuscript, combine the transcendent symbolism of the snake and the bird. Right, an image of spiritual transcendence. Muhammad, on the winged mare Burak, flies through the celestial spheres. In the dreams and fantasies of many modern people, the flights of the great rockets of space research have often appeared as symbolic 20th century embodiments of the urge toward liberation and release that is called transcendence. End of photo captions. Part 3. The Process of Individuation by M. L. von Franz. The Pattern of Psychic Growth. At the beginning of this book, Dr. C. G. Jung introduced the reader to the concept of the unconscious, its personal and collective structures, and its symbolic mode of expression. Once one has seen the vital importance, that is, the healing or destructive impact of the symbols produced by the unconscious, there remains the difficult problem of interpretation. Dr. Jung has shown that everything depends on whether any particular interpretation clicks and is meaningful to the individual concerned. In this way, he has indicated the possible meaning and function of dream symbolism. But in the development of Jung's theory, this possibility raised another question. What is the purpose of the total dream life of the individual? What role do dreams play, not only in the immediate psychic economy of the human being, but in his life as a whole? By observing a great many people and studying their dreams, he estimated that he interpreted at least 80,000 dreams, Jung discovered not only that all dreams are relevant in varying degrees to the life of the dreamer, but that they are all parts of one great web of psychological factors. He also found that on the whole they seem to follow an arrangement or pattern. This pattern Jung called the process of individuation. Since dreams produce different scenes and images every night, people who are not careful observers will probably be unaware of any pattern. But if one watches one's own dreams over a period of years and studies the entire sequence, one will see that certain contents emerge, disappear, and then turn up again. Many people even dream repeatedly of the same figures, landscapes, or situations, and if one follows these through a whole series, one will see that they change slowly but perceptibly. These changes can be accelerated if the dreamer's conscious attitude is influenced by appropriate interpretation of the dreams and their symbolic contents. Thus, our dream life creates a meandering pattern in which individual strands or tendencies become visible, then vanish, then return again. If one watches this meandering design over a long period of time, one can observe a sort of hidden regulating or directing tendency at work, creating a slow, imperceptible process of psychic growth, the process of individuation. Gradually, a wider and more mature personality emerges, and by degrees becomes effective and even visible to others. The fact that we often speak of arrested development shows that we assume that such a process of growth and maturation is possible with every individual. Since this psychic growth cannot be brought about by a conscious effort of willpower, but happens involuntarily and naturally, it is in dreams frequently symbolized by the tree, whose slow, powerful, involuntary growth fulfills a definite pattern. The organizing center from which the regulatory effect stems seems to be a sort of nuclear atom in our psychic system. One could also call it the inventor, organizer, and source of dream images. Jung called this center the self, and described it as the totality of the whole psyche, in order to distinguish it from the ego, which constitutes only a small part of the total psyche. Throughout the ages, men have been intuitively aware of the existence of such an inner center. The Greeks called it man's inner daimon. In Egypt, it was expressed by the concept of the Ba-soul, and the Romans worshipped it as the genius native to each individual. In more primitive societies, it was often thought of as a protective spirit embodied within an animal, or a fetish. This inner center is realized in exceptionally pure, unspoiled form by the Naskapi Indians, who still exist in the forests of the Labrador Peninsula. These simple people are hunters who live in isolated family groups so far from one another that they have not been able to evolve tribal customs or collective religious beliefs and ceremonies. In his lifelong solitude, the Naskapi hunter has to rely on his own inner voices and unconscious revelations. He has no religious teachers who tell him what he should believe, no rituals, festivals, or customs to help him along. In his basic view of life, the soul of man is simply an inner companion whom he calls my friend, or Mr. Pio, meaning great man. Mr. Pio dwells in the heart and is immortal. In the moment of death, or shortly before, he leaves the individual and later reincarnates himself in another being. Those Naskapi who pay attention to their dreams and who try to find their meaning and test their truth can enter into a deeper connection with the great man. He favors such people and sends them more and better dreams. Thus, the major obligation of an individual Naskapi is to follow the instructions given by his dreams and then to give permanent form to their contents in art. Lies and dishonesty drive the great man away from one's inner realm, whereas generosity and love of one's neighbors and of animals attract him and give him life. Dreams give the Naskapi complete ability to find his way in life, not only in the inner world, but also in the outer world of nature. They help him to foretell the weather and give him invaluable guidance in his hunting, upon which his life depends. I mention these very primitive people because they are uncontaminated by our civilized ideas and still have natural insight into the essence of what Jung calls the self. The self can be defined as an inner guiding factor that is different from the conscious personality and that can be grasped only through the investigation of one's own dreams. These show it to be the regulating center that brings about a constant extension and maturing of the personality. But this larger, more nearly total aspect of the psyche appears first as merely an inborn possibility. It may emerge very slightly, or it may develop relatively completely during one's lifetime. How far it develops depends on whether or not the ego is willing to listen to the messages of the self. Just as the Nascapi have noticed that a person who is receptive to the hints of the great man gets better and more helpful dreams, we could add that the inborn great man becomes more real within the receptive person than in those who neglect him. Such a person also becomes a more complete human being. It even seems as if the ego has not been produced by nature to follow its own arbitrary impulses to an unlimited extent, but to help to make real the totality, the whole psyche. It is the ego that serves to light up the entire system, allowing it to become conscious and thus to be realized. If, for example, I have an artistic talent of which my ego is not conscious, nothing will happen to it. The gift may as well be non-existent. Only if my ego notices it can I bring it into reality. The inborn but hidden totality of the psyche is not the same thing as a wholeness that is fully realized and lived. One could picture this in the following way. The seed of a mountain pine contains the whole future tree in a latent form, but each seed falls at a certain time onto a particular place in which there are a number of special factors, such as the quality of the soil and the stones, the slope of the land, and its exposure to sun and wind. The latent totality of the pine in the seed reacts to these circumstances by avoiding the stones and inclining toward the sun, with the result that the tree's growth is shaped. Thus an individual pine slowly comes into existence, constituting the fulfillment of its totality, its emergence into the realm of reality. Without the living tree, the image of the pine is only a possibility or an abstract idea. Again, the realization of this uniqueness in the individual man is the goal of the process of individuation. From one point of view, this process takes place in man, as well as in every other living being, by itself and in the unconscious. It is a process by which man lives out his innate human nature. Strictly speaking, however, the process of individuation is real only if the individual is aware of it and consequently makes a living connection with it. We do not know whether the pine tree is aware of its own growth, whether it enjoys and suffers the different vicissitudes that shape it. But man certainly is able to participate consciously in his development. He even feels that from time to time, by making free decisions, he can cooperate actively with it. This cooperation belongs to the process of individuation in the narrower sense of the word. Man, however, experiences something that is not contained in our metaphor of the pine tree. The individuation process is more than a coming to terms between the inborn germ of wholeness and the outer acts of fate. Its subjective experience conveys the feeling that some suprapersonal force is actively interfering in a creative way. One sometimes feels that the unconscious is leading the way in accordance with a secret design. It is as if something is looking at me, something that I do not see, but that sees me. Perhaps that great man in the heart, who tells me his opinions about me by means of dreams. But this creatively active aspect of the psychic nucleus can come into play only when the ego gets rid of all purposive and wishful aims and tries to get to a deeper, more basic form of existence. The ego must be able to listen attentively and to give itself, without any further design or purpose, to that inner urge toward growth. Many existentialist philosophers try to describe this state, but they go only as far as stripping off the illusions of consciousness. They go right up to the door of the unconscious and then fail to open it. People living in cultures more securely rooted than our own have less trouble in understanding that it is necessary to give up the utilitarian attitude of conscious planning in order to make way for the inner growth of the personality. I once met an elderly lady who had not achieved much in her life, in terms of outward achievement, but she had in fact made a good marriage with a difficult husband, and had somehow developed into a mature personality. When she complained to me that she had not done anything in her life, I told her a story related by a Chinese sage, Zhuangzi. She understood immediately and felt great relief. This is the story. A wandering carpenter called Stone saw on his travels a gigantic old oak tree standing in a field near an earth altar. The carpenter said to his apprentice, who was admiring the oak, "This is a useless tree. If you wanted to make a ship, it would soon rot. If you wanted to make tools, they would break. You can't do anything useful with this tree, and that's why it has become so old." But in an inn that same evening, when the carpenter went to sleep, the old oak tree appeared to him in his dream and said, "Why do you compare me to your cultivated trees, such as whitethorn, pear, orange, and apple trees, and all the others that bear fruit? Even before they can ripen their fruit, people attack and violate them. Their branches are broken, their twigs are torn. Their own gifts bring harm to them, and they cannot live out their natural span. That is what happens everywhere, and that is why I have long since tried to become completely useless. You poor mortal! Imagine, if I had been useful in any way, would I have reached this size? Furthermore, you and I are both creatures, and how can one creature set himself so high as to judge another creature? You useless mortal man, what do you know about useless trees?" The carpenter woke up and meditated upon his dream, and later, when his apprentice asked him why just this one tree served to protect the earth altar, he answered, "Keep your mouth shut. Let's hear no more about it. The tree grew here on purpose, because anywhere else people would have ill-treated it. If it were not the tree of the earth altar, it might have been chopped down." The carpenter obviously understood his dream. He saw that simply to fulfill one's destiny is the greatest human achievement, and that our utilitarian notions have to give way in the face of the demands of our unconscious psyche. If we translate this metaphor into psychological language, the tree symbolizes the process of individuation, giving a lesson to our short-sighted ego. Under the tree that fulfilled its destiny, there was, in Zhuangzi's story, an earth altar. This was a crude, unwrought stone upon which people made sacrifices to the local god who owned this piece of land. The symbol of the earth altar points to the fact that in order to bring the individuation process into reality, one must surrender consciously to the power of the unconscious, instead of thinking in terms of what one should do, or of what is generally thought right, or of what usually happens. One must simply listen, in order to learn what the inner totality, the self, wants one to do here and now in a particular situation. Note, the local god to whom sacrifices were made on the stone earth altar corresponds in many respects to the antique genius loci. See Henri Maspero, La Chine Antique, Paris, 1955, page 140 and following. This information is owed to the kindness of Miss Ariane Rump. End of note. Our attitude must be like that of the mountain pine mentioned above. It does not get annoyed when its growth is obstructed by a stone, nor does it make plans about how to overcome the obstacles. It merely tries to feel whether it should grow more toward the left or the right, toward the slope or away from it. Like the tree, we should give in to this almost imperceptible yet powerfully dominating impulse, an impulse that comes from the urge toward unique, creative self-realization. And this is a process in which one must repeatedly seek out and find something that is not yet known to anyone. The guiding hints or impulses come not from the ego, but from the totality of the psyche, the self. It is, moreover, useless to cast furtive glances at the way someone else is developing, because each of us has a unique task of self-realization. Although many human problems are similar, they are never identical. All pine trees are very much alike, otherwise we should not recognize them as pines, yet none is exactly the same as another. Because of these factors of sameness and difference, it is difficult to summarize the infinite variations of the process of individuation. The fact is that each person has to do something different, something that is uniquely his own. Many people have criticized the Jungian approach for not presenting psychic material systematically. But these critics forget that the material itself is a living experience charged with emotion, by nature irrational and ever-changing, which does not lend itself to systematization except in the most superficial fashion. Modern depth psychology has here reached the same limits that confront microphysics, That is, when we are dealing with statistical averages, a rational and systematic description of the facts is possible, but when we are attempting to describe a single psychic event, we can do no more than present an honest picture of it from as many angles as possible. In the same way, scientists have to admit that they do not know what light is. They can say only that in certain experimental conditions it seems to consist of particles, while in other experimental conditions it seems to consist of waves. But what it is in itself is not known. The psychology of the unconscious and any description of the process of individuation encounter comparable difficulties of definition, but I will try here to give a sketch of some of their most typical features. The first approach of the unconscious. For most people, the years of youth are characterized by a state of gradual awakening, in which the individual slowly becomes aware of the world and of himself. Childhood is a period of great emotional intensity, and a child's earliest dreams often manifest in symbolic form the basic structure of the psyche, indicating how it will later shape the destiny of the individual concerned. For example, Jung once told a group of students about a young woman who was so haunted by anxiety that she committed suicide at the age of 26. As a small child, she had dreamed that Jack Frost had entered her room while she was lying in bed and pinched her on the stomach. She woke and discovered that she had pinched herself with her own hand. The dream did not frighten her. She merely remembered that she had had such a dream. But the fact that she did not react emotionally to her strange encounter with the demon of the cold, of congealed life, did not augur well for the future, and was itself abnormal. It was with a cold, unfeeling hand that she later put an end to her life. From this single dream, it is possible to deduce the tragic fate of the dreamer, which was anticipated by her psyche in childhood. Sometimes it is not a dream, but some very impressive and unforgettable real event that, like a prophecy, anticipates the future in symbolic form. It is well known that children often forget events that seem impressive to adults, but keep a vivid recollection of some incident or story that no one else has noticed. When we look into one of these childhood memories, we usually find that it depicts, if interpreted as if it were a symbol, a basic problem of the child's psychic makeup. When a child reaches school age, the phase of building up the ego and of adapting to the outer world begins. This phase generally brings a number of painful shocks. At the same time, some children begin to feel very different from others, and this feeling of being unique brings a certain sadness that is part of the loneliness of many youngsters. The imperfections of the world and the evil within oneself as well as outside become conscious problems. The child must try to cope with urgent but not yet understood inner impulses as well as the demands of the outer world. If the development of consciousness is disturbed in its normal unfolding, children frequently retire from outer or inner difficulties into an inner fortress, and when that happens, their dreams and symbolic drawings of unconscious material often reveal to an unusual degree a type of circular, quadrangular, and nuclear motif, which I will explain later. This refers to the previously mentioned psychic nucleus, the vital center of the personality from which the whole structural development of consciousness stems. It is natural that the image of the center should appear in an especially striking way when the psychic life of the individual is threatened. From this central nucleus, as far as we know today, the whole building up of ego consciousness is directed, the ego apparently being a duplicate or structural counterpart of the original center. In this early phase, there are many children who earnestly seek for some meaning in life that could help them to deal with the chaos both within and outside themselves. There are others, however, who are still unconsciously carried along by the dynamism of inherited and instinctive archetypal patterns. These young people are not concerned about the deeper meaning of life because their experiences with love, nature, sport, and work contain an immediate and satisfying meaning for them. They are not necessarily more superficial. Usually they are carried by the stream of life with less friction and disturbance than their more introspective fellows. If I travel in a car or train without looking out, it is only the stops, starts, and sudden turns that make me realize I am moving at all. The actual process of individuation, the conscious coming to terms with one's own inner center, psychic nucleus, or self, generally begins with a wounding of the personality and the suffering that accompanies it. This initial shock amounts to a sort of call, although it is not often recognized as such. On the contrary, the ego feels hampered in its will or its desire, and usually projects the obstruction onto something external. That is, the ego accuses God or the economic situation or the boss or the marriage partner of being responsible for whatever is obstructing it. Or perhaps everything seems outwardly all right, but beneath the surface a person is suffering from a deadly boredom that makes everything seem meaningless and empty. Many myths and fairy tales symbolically describe this initial stage in the process of individuation by telling of a king who has fallen ill or grown old. Other familiar story patterns are that a royal couple is barren, or that a monster steals all the women, children, horses, and wealth of the kingdom, or that a demon keeps the king's army or his ship from proceeding on its course, or that darkness hangs over the lands, wells dry up, and flood, drought, and frost afflict the country. Thus it seems as if the initial encounter with the self casts a dark shadow ahead of time, or as if the inner friend comes at first like a trapper to catch the helplessly struggling ego in his snare. In myths, one finds that the magic or talisman that can cure the misfortune of the king or his country always proves to be something very special. In one tale, a white blackbird, or a fish that carries a golden ring in its gills, is needed to restore the king's health. In another, the king wants the water of life, or 3 golden hairs from the head of the devil, or a woman's golden plate, and afterward, naturally, the owner of the plate. Whatever it is, the thing that can drive away the evil is always unique and hard to find. It is exactly the same in the initial crisis in the life of an individual. One is seeking something that is impossible to find, or about which nothing is known. In such moments, all well-meant, sensible advice is completely useless. Advice that urges one to try to be responsible, to take a holiday, not to work so hard, or to work harder, to have more or less human contact, or to take up a hobby. None of that helps, or at best only rarely. There is only one thing that seems to work, and that is to turn directly toward the approaching darkness, without prejudice and totally naively, and to try to find out what its secret aim is, and what it wants from you. The hidden purpose of the oncoming darkness is generally something so unusual, so unique and unexpected, that as a rule one can find out what it is only by means of dreams and fantasies welling up from the unconscious. If one focuses attention on the unconscious without rash assumptions or emotional rejection, it often breaks through in a flow of helpful symbolic images, but not always. Sometimes it first offers a series of painful realizations of what is wrong with one's self and one's conscious attitudes. Then one must begin the process by swallowing all sorts of bitter truths. The realization of the shadow. Whether the unconscious comes up at first in a helpful or a negative form, after a time the need usually arises to readapt the conscious attitude in a better way to the unconscious factors, therefore to accept what seems to be criticism from the unconscious. Through dreams one becomes acquainted with aspects of one's own personality that for various reasons one has preferred not to look at too closely. This is what Jung called the realization of the shadow. He used the term shadow for this unconscious part of the personality because it actually often appears in dreams in a personified form. The shadow is not the whole of the unconscious personality. It represents unknown or little-known attributes and qualities of the ego, aspects that mostly belong to the personal sphere and that could just as well be conscious. In some aspects, the shadow can also consist of collective factors that stem from a source outside the individual's personal life. When an individual makes an attempt to see his shadow, he becomes aware of, and often ashamed of, those qualities and impulses he denies in himself but can plainly see in other people, such things as egotism, mental laziness and sloppiness, unreal fantasies, schemes and plots, carelessness and cowardice, inordinate love of money and possessions, in short, all the little sins about which he might previously have told himself, "That doesn't matter. Nobody will notice it, and in any case other people do it too." If you feel an overwhelming rage coming up in you when a friend reproaches you about a fault, you can be fairly sure that at this point you will find a part of your shadow of which you are unconscious. It is, of course, natural to become annoyed when others who are no better criticize you because of shadow faults. But what can you say if your own dreams, an inner judge in your own being, reproach you? That is the moment when the ego gets caught, and the result is usually embarrassed silence. Afterward, the painful and lengthy work of self-education begins, a work, we might say, that is the psychological equivalent of the labors of Hercules. This unfortunate hero's first task, you will remember, was to clean up in one day the Augean stables, in which hundreds of cattle had dropped their dung for many decades, a task so enormous that the ordinary mortal would be overcome by discouragement at the mere thought of it. The shadow does not consist only of omissions. It shows up just as often in an impulsive or inadvertent act. Before one has time to think, the evil remark pops out, the plot is hatched, the wrong decision is made, and one is confronted with results that were never intended or consciously wanted. Furthermore, the shadow is exposed to collective infections to a much greater extent than is the conscious personality. When a man is alone, for instance, he feels relatively all right, but as soon as the others do dark, primitive things, he begins to fear that if he doesn't join in, he will be considered a fool. Thus he gives way to impulses that do not really belong to him at all. It is particularly in contacts with people of the same sex that one stumbles over both one's own shadow and those of other people. Although we do see the shadow in a person of the opposite sex, we are usually much less annoyed by it and can more easily pardon it. In dreams and myths, therefore, the shadow appears as a person of the same sex as that of the dreamer. The following dream may serve as an example. The dreamer was a man of 48 who tried to live very much for and by himself, working hard and disciplining himself, repressing pleasure and spontaneity to a far greater extent than suited his real nature. I owned and inhabited a very big house in town, and I didn't yet know all its different parts, so I took a walk through it and discovered, mainly in the cellar, several rooms about which I knew nothing, and even exits leading into other cellars or into subterranean streets. I felt uneasy when I found that several of these exits were not locked, and some had no locks at all. Moreover, there were some laborers at work in the neighborhood who could have sneaked in. When I came up again to the ground floor, I passed a backyard where again I discovered different exits into the street or into other houses. When I tried to investigate them more closely, a man came up to me laughing loudly and calling out that we were old pals from the elementary school. I remembered him, too, and while he was telling me about his life, I walked along with him toward the exit and strolled with him through the streets. There was a strange chiaroscuro in the air as we walked through an enormous circular street and arrived at a green lawn where 3 galloping horses suddenly passed us. They were beautiful, strong animals, wild but well-groomed, and they had no rider with them. Had they run away from military service? The maze of strange passages, chambers, and unlocked exits in the cellar recalls the old Egyptian representation of the underworld, which is a well-known symbol of the unconscious with its unknown possibilities. It also shows how one is open to other influences in one's unconscious shadow side and how uncanny and alien elements can break in. The cellar, one can say, is the basement of the dreamer's psyche. In the backyard of the strange building, which represents the still unperceived psychic scope of the dreamer's personality, an old school friend suddenly turns up. This person obviously personifies another aspect of the dreamer himself, an aspect that had been part of his life as a child, but that he had forgotten and lost. It often happens that a person's childhood qualities, for instance, gaiety, irascibility, or perhaps trustfulness, suddenly disappear, and one does not know where or how they have gone. It is such a lost characteristic of the dreamer that now returns from the backyard and tries to make friends again. This figure probably stands for the dreamer's neglected capacity for enjoying life and for his extroverted shadow side. But we soon learn why the dreamer feels uneasy just before meeting this seemingly harmless old friend. When he strolls with him in the street, the horses break loose. The dreamer thinks they may have escaped from military service, that is to say, from the conscious discipline that has hitherto characterized his life. The fact that the horses have no rider shows that instinctive drives can get away from conscious control. In this old friend and in the horses, all the positive force reappears that was lacking before and that was badly needed by the dreamer. This is a problem that often comes up when one meets one's other side. The shadow usually contains values that are needed by consciousness, but that exist in a form that makes it difficult to integrate them into one's life. The passages and the large house in this dream also show that the dreamer does not yet know his own psychic dimensions and is not yet able to fill them out. The shadow in this dream is typical for an introvert, a man who tends to retire too much from outer life. In the case of an extrovert, who is turned more toward outer objects and outer life, the shadow would look quite different. A young man who had a very lively temperament embarked again and again on successful enterprises, while at the same time his dreams insisted that he should finish off a piece of private creative work he had begun. The following was one of those dreams. A man is lying on a couch and has pulled the cover over his face. He is a Frenchman, a desperado who would take on any criminal job. An official is accompanying me downstairs, and I know that a plot has been made against me, namely, that the Frenchman should kill me as if by chance. That is how it would look from the outside. He actually sneaks up behind me when we approach the exit, but I am on my guard. A tall, portly man, rather rich and influential, suddenly leans against the wall beside me, feeling ill. I quickly grab the opportunity to kill the official by stabbing his heart. One only notices a bit of moisture. This is said like a comment. Now I am safe, for the Frenchman won't attack me, since the man who gave him his orders is dead. Probably the official and the successful portly man are the same person, the latter somehow replacing the former. The desperado represents the other side of the dreamer, his introversion, which has reached a completely destitute state. He lies on a couch, that is, he is passive, and pulls the cover over his face because he wants to be left alone. The official, on the other hand, and the prosperous portly man, who are secretly the same person, personify the dreamer's successful outer responsibilities and activities. The sudden illness of the portly man is connected with the fact that this dreamer had in fact become ill several times when he had allowed his dynamic energy to explode too forcibly in his external life. But this successful man has no blood in his veins, only a sort of moisture, which means that these external ambitious activities of the dreamer contain no genuine life and no passion, but are bloodless mechanisms. Thus it would be no real loss if the portly man were killed. At the end of the dream, the Frenchman is satisfied. He obviously represents a positive shadow figure who had turned negative and dangerous only because the conscious attitude of the dreamer did not agree with him. This dream shows us that the shadow can consist of many different elements, for instance, of unconscious ambition, the successful portly man, and of introversion, the Frenchman. This particular dreamer's association to the French, moreover, was that they know how to handle love affairs very well. Therefore, the two shadow figures also represent two well-known drives, power and sex. The power drive appears momentarily in a double form, both as an official and as a successful man. The official, or a civil servant, personifies collective adaptation, whereas the successful man denotes ambition. But naturally, both serve the power drive. When the dreamer succeeds in stopping this dangerous inner force, the Frenchman is suddenly no longer hostile. In other words, the equally dangerous aspect of the sex drive has also surrendered. Obviously, the problem of the shadow plays a great role in all political conflicts. If the man who had this dream had not been sensible about his shadow problem, he could easily have identified the desperate Frenchman with the dangerous communists of outer life, or the official plus the prosperous man with the grasping capitalists. In this way, he would have avoided seeing that he had within him such warring elements. If people observe their own unconscious tendencies in other people, this is called a projection. Political agitation in all countries is full of such projections, just as much as the backyard gossip of little groups and individuals. Projections of all kinds obscure our view of our fellow men, spoiling its objectivity, and thus spoiling all possibility of genuine human relationships. And there is an additional disadvantage in projecting our shadow. If we identify our own shadow with, say, the communists or the capitalists, a part of our own personality remains on the opposing side. The result is that we shall constantly, though involuntarily, do things behind our own backs that support this other side, and thus we shall unwittingly help our enemy. If, on the contrary, we realize the projection and can discuss matters without fear or hostility, dealing with the other person sensibly, then there is a chance of mutual understanding, or at least of a truce. Whether the shadow becomes our friend or enemy depends largely upon ourselves. As the dreams of the unexplored house and the French desperado both show, the shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. In fact, he is exactly like any human being with whom one has to get along, sometimes by giving in, sometimes by resisting, sometimes by giving love, whatever the situation requires. The shadow becomes hostile only when he is ignored or misunderstood. Sometimes, though not often, an individual feels impelled to live out the worst side of his nature and to repress his better side. In such cases, the shadow appears as a positive figure in his dreams. But to a person who lives out his natural emotions and feelings, the shadow may appear as a cold and negative intellectual. It then personifies poisonous judgments and negative thoughts that have been held back. So whatever form it takes, the function of the shadow is to represent the opposite side of the ego and to embody just those qualities that one dislikes most in other people. It would be relatively easy if one could integrate the shadow into the conscious personality just by attempting to be honest and to use one's insight. But unfortunately, such an attempt does not always work. There is such a passionate drive within the shadowy part of oneself that reason may not prevail against it. A bitter experience coming from the outside may occasionally help. A brick, so to speak, has to drop on one's head to put a stop to shadow drives and impulses. At times, a heroic decision may serve to halt them, but such a superhuman effort is usually possible only if the great man within, the self, helps the individual to carry it through. The fact that the shadow contains the overwhelming power of irresistible impulse does not mean, however, that the drive should always be heroically repressed. Sometimes the shadow is powerful because the urge of the self is pointing in the same direction, and so one does not know whether it is the self or the shadow that is behind the inner pressure. In the unconscious, one is unfortunately in the same situation as in a moonlit landscape. All the contents are blurred and merge into one another, and one never knows exactly what or where anything is, or where one thing begins and ends. This is known as the contamination of unconscious contents. When Jung called one aspect of the unconscious personality the shadow, he was referring to a relatively well-defined factor. But sometimes everything that is unknown to the ego is mixed up with the shadow, including even the most valuable and highest forces. Who, for instance, could be quite sure whether the French desperado in the dream I quoted was a useless tramp or a most valuable introvert? And the bolting horses of the preceding dream, should they be allowed to run free or not? In a case when the dream itself does not make things clear, the conscious personality will have to make the decision. If the shadow figure contains valuable, vital forces, they ought to be assimilated into actual experience and not repressed. It is up to the ego to give up its pride and priggishness and to live out something that seems to be dark, but actually may not be. This can require a sacrifice just as heroic as the conquest of passion, but in an opposite sense. The ethical difficulties that arise when one meets one's shadow are well described in the 18th book of the Quran. In this tale, Moses meets Khidr, the Green One, or first angel of God, in the desert. They wander along together, and Khidr expresses his fear that Moses will not be able to witness his deeds without indignation. If Moses cannot bear with him and trust him, Khidr will have to leave. Presently, Khidr scuttles the fishing boat of some poor villagers. Then, before Moses' eyes, he kills a handsome young man, and finally he restores the fallen wall of a city of unbelievers. Moses cannot help expressing his indignation, and so Khidr has to leave him. Before his departure, however, he explains the reasons for his actions. By scuttling the boat, he actually saved it for its owners because pirates were on their way to steal it. As it is, the fisherman can salvage it. The handsome young man was on his way to commit a crime, and by killing him, Khidr saved his pious parents from infamy. By restoring the wall, 2 pious young men were saved from ruin because their treasure was buried under it. Moses, who had been so morally indignant, saw now, too late, that his judgment had been too hasty. Khidr's doings had seemed to be totally evil, but in fact they were not. Looking at this story naively, one might assume that Khidr is the lawless, capricious, evil shadow of pious, law-abiding Moses. But this is not the case. Khidr is much more the personification of some secret creative actions of the Godhead. One can find a similar meaning in the famous Indian story of the king and the corpse, as interpreted by Henry Zimmer. It is no accident that I have not quoted a dream to illustrate this subtle problem. I have chosen this well-known story from the Quran because it sums up the experience of a lifetime, which would very rarely be expressed with such clarity in an individual dream. When dark figures turn up in our dreams and seem to want something, we cannot be sure whether they personify merely a shadowy part of ourselves, or the self, or both at the same time. Divining in advance whether our dark partner symbolizes a shortcoming that we should overcome, or a meaningful bit of life that we should accept, this is one of the most difficult problems that we encounter on the way to individuation. Moreover, the dream symbols are often so subtle and complicated that one cannot be sure of their interpretation. In such a situation, all one can do is accept the discomfort of ethical doubt, making no final decisions or commitments, and continuing to watch the dreams. This resembles the situation of Cinderella, when her stepmother threw a heap of good and bad peas in front of her and asked her to sort them out. Although it seemed quite hopeless, Cinderella began patiently to sort the peas, and suddenly doves, or ants in some versions, came to help her. These creatures symbolize helpful, deeply unconscious impulses that can only be felt in one's body, as it were, and that point to a way out. Somewhere, right at the bottom of one's own being, one generally does know where one should go and what one should do. But there are times when the clown we call I behaves in such a distracting fashion that the inner voice cannot make its presence felt. Sometimes all attempts to understand the hints of the unconscious fail, and in such a difficulty one can only have the courage to do what seems to be right, while being ready to change course if the suggestions of the unconscious should suddenly point in another direction. It may also happen, although this is unusual, that a person will find it better to resist the urge of the unconscious, even at the price of feeling warped by doing so, rather than depart too far from the state of being human. This would be the situation of people who had to live out a criminal disposition in order to be completely themselves. The strength and inner clarity needed by the ego in order to make such a decision stems secretly from the great man, who apparently does not want to reveal himself too clearly. It may be that the self wants the ego to make a free choice, or it may be that the self depends on human consciousness and its decisions to help him to become manifest. When it comes to such difficult ethical problems, no one can truly judge the deeds of others. Each man has to look to his own problem and try to determine what is right for himself. As an old Zen Buddhist master said, we must follow the example of the cowherd, who watches his ox with a stick so that it will not graze on other people's meadows. These new discoveries of depth psychology are bound to make some change in our collective ethical views, for they will compel us to judge all human actions in a much more individual and subtle way. End of Side 5. To continue, turn the cassette over. Side 6. Man and His Symbols, by Carl Jung. Continuing with the process of individuation, on page 176. The discovery of the unconscious is one of the most far-reaching discoveries of recent times, but the fact that recognition of its unconscious reality involves honest self-examination and reorganization of one's life causes many people to continue to behave as if nothing at all has happened. It takes a lot of courage to take the unconscious seriously and to tackle the problems it raises. Most people are too indolent to think deeply about even those moral aspects of their behavior of which they are conscious. They are certainly too lazy to consider how the unconscious affects them. The anima, the woman within. Difficult and subtle ethical problems are not invariably brought up by the appearance of the shadow itself. Often another inner figure emerges. If the dreamer is a man, he will discover a female personification of his unconscious, and it will be a male figure in the case of a woman. Often this second symbolic figure turns up behind the shadow, bringing up new and different problems. Jung called its male and female forms animus and anima. The anima is a personification of all feminine psychological tendencies in a man's psyche, such as vague feelings and moods, prophetic hunches, receptiveness to the irrational, capacity for personal love, feeling for nature, and, last but not least, his relation to the unconscious. It is no mere chance that in olden times priestesses, like the Greek Sibyl, were used to fathom the divine will and to make connection with the gods. A particularly good example of how the anima is experienced as an inner figure in a man's psyche is found in the medicine men and prophets, shamans, among the Eskimo and other Arctic tribes. Some of these even wear women's clothes or have breasts depicted on their garments in order to manifest their inner feminine side, the side that enables them to connect with the ghost land, that is, what we call the unconscious. One reported case tells of a young man who was being initiated by an older shaman and who was buried by him in a snow hole. He fell into a state of dreaminess and exhaustion. In this coma, he suddenly saw a woman who emitted light. She instructed him in all he needed to know, and later, as his protective spirit, helped him to practice his difficult profession by relating him to the powers of the beyond. Such an experience shows the anima as the personification of a man's unconscious. In its individual manifestation, the character of a man's anima is as a rule shaped by his mother. If he feels that his mother had a negative influence on him, his anima will often express itself in irritable, depressed moods, uncertainty, insecurity, and touchiness. If, however, he is able to overcome the negative assaults on himself, they can even serve to reinforce his masculinity. Within the soul of such a man, the negative mother anima figure will endlessly repeat this theme. I am nothing. Nothing makes any sense. With others it's different, but for me, I enjoy nothing. These anima moods cause a sort of dullness, a fear of disease, of impotence, or of accidents. The whole of life takes on a sad and oppressive aspect. Such dark moods can even lure a man to suicide, in which case the anima becomes a death demon. She appears in this role in Cocteau's film Orphée. The French call such an anima figure a femme fatale. A milder version of this dark anima is personified by the Queen of the Night in Mozart's Magic Flute. The Greek sirens, or the German Lorelei, also personify this dangerous aspect of the anima, which in this form symbolizes destructive illusion. The following Siberian tale illustrates the behavior of such a destructive anima. One day, a lonely hunter sees a beautiful woman emerging from the deep forest on the other side of the river. She waves at him and sings, "Oh, come, lonely hunter, in the stillness of dusk. Come, come, I miss you, I miss you. Now I will embrace you, embrace you. Come, come, my nest is near, my nest is near. Come, come, lonely hunter, now in the stillness of dusk." He throws off his clothes and swims across the river, but suddenly she flies away in the form of an owl, laughing mockingly at him. When he tries to swim back to find his clothes, he drowns in the cold river. In this tale, the anima symbolizes an unreal dream of love, happiness, and maternal warmth, her nest, a dream that lures men away from reality. The hunter is drowned because he ran after a wishful fantasy that could not be fulfilled. Another way in which the negative anima in a man's personality can be revealed is in waspish, poisonous, effeminate remarks by which he devalues everything. Remarks of this sort always contain a cheap twisting of the truth and are in a subtle way destructive. There are legends throughout the world in which a poison damsel, as they call her in the Orient, appears. She is a beautiful creature who has weapons hidden in her body, or a secret poison with which she kills her lovers during their first night together. In this guise, the anima is as cold and reckless as certain uncanny aspects of nature itself, and in Europe is often expressed to this day by the belief in witches. If, on the other hand, a man's experience of his mother has been positive, this can also affect his anima in typical but different ways, with the result that he either becomes effeminate or is preyed upon by women, and thus is unable to cope with the hardships of life. An anima of this sort can turn men into sentimentalists, or they may become as touchy as old maids, or as sensitive as the fairy tale princess who could feel a pea under 30 mattresses. A still more subtle manifestation of a negative anima appears in some fairy tales in the form of a princess who asks her suitors to answer a series of riddles, or perhaps to hide themselves under her nose. If they cannot give the answers, or if she can find them, they must die, and she invariably wins. The anima in this guise involves men in a destructive intellectual game. We can notice the effect of this anima trick in all those neurotic pseudo-intellectual dialogues that inhibit a man from getting into direct touch with life and its real decisions. He reflects about life so much that he cannot live it, and loses all his spontaneity and outgoing feeling. The most frequent manifestation of the anima takes the form of erotic fantasy. Men may be driven to nurse their fantasies by looking at films and striptease shows, or by daydreaming over pornographic material. This is a crude, primitive aspect of the anima, which becomes compulsive only when a man does not sufficiently cultivate his feeling relationships, when his feeling attitude toward life has remained infantile. All these aspects of the anima have the same tendency that we have observed in the shadow. That is, they can be projected so that they appear to the man to be the qualities of some particular woman. It is the presence of the anima that causes a man to fall suddenly in love when he sees a woman for the first time and knows at once that this is she. In this situation, the man feels as if he has known this woman intimately for all time. He falls for her so helplessly that it looks to outsiders like complete madness. Women who are of fairy-like character especially attract such anima projections, because men can attribute almost anything to a creature who is so fascinatingly vague, and can thus proceed to weave fantasies around her. The projection of the anima in such a sudden and passionate form as a love affair can greatly disturb a man's marriage, and can lead to the so-called human triangle, with its accompanying difficulties. A bearable solution to such a drama can be found only if the anima is recognized as an inner power. The secret aim of the unconscious in bringing about such an entanglement is to force a man to develop and to bring his own being to maturity by integrating more of his unconscious personality and bringing it into his real life. But I have said enough about the negative side of the anima. There are just as many important positive aspects. The anima is, for instance, responsible for the fact that a man is able to find the right marriage partner. Another function is at least equally important. Whenever a man's logical mind is incapable of discerning facts that are hidden in his unconscious, the anima helps him to dig them out. Even more vital is the role that the anima plays in putting a man's mind in tune with the right inner values, and thereby opening the way into more profound inner depths. It is as if an inner radio becomes tuned to a certain wavelength that excludes irrelevancies, but allows the voice of the great man to be heard. In establishing this inner radio reception, the anima takes on the role of guide or mediator to the world within and to the self. That is how she appears in the example of the initiations of shamans that I described earlier. This is the role of Beatrice in Dante's Paradiso, and also of the goddess Isis, when she appeared in a dream to Apuleius, the famous author of the Golden Ass, in order to initiate him into a higher, more spiritual form of life. The dream of a 45-year-old psychotherapist may help to make clear how the anima can be an inner guide. As he was going to bed on the evening before he had this dream, he thought to himself that it was hard to stand alone in life, lacking the support of a church. He found himself envying people who are protected by the maternal embrace of an organization. He had been born a Protestant, but no longer had any religious affiliation. This was his dream. I am in the aisle of an old church, filled with people. Together with my mother and my wife, I sit at the end of the aisle in what seem to be extra seats. I am to celebrate the Mass as a priest, and I have a big Mass book in my hands, or rather a prayer book or an anthology of poems. This book is not familiar to me, and I cannot find the right text. I am very excited because I have to begin soon, and, to add to my troubles, my mother and wife disturb me by chattering about unimportant trifles. Now the organ stops, and everybody is waiting for me, so I get up in a determined way and ask one of the nuns who is kneeling behind me to hand me her Mass book and point out the right place, which she does in an obliging manner. Now, like a sort of sexton, this same nun precedes me to the altar, which is somewhere behind me and to the left, as if we are approaching it from a side aisle. The Mass book is like a sheet of pictures, a sort of board, 3 feet long and a foot wide, and on it is the text with ancient pictures in columns, one beside the other. First, the nun has to read a part of the liturgy before I begin, and I have still not found the right place in the text. She has told me that it is number 15, but the numbers are not clear, and I cannot find it. With determination, however, I turn toward the congregation, and now I have found number 15, the next to the last on the board, although I do not yet know if I shall be able to decipher it. I want to try all the same. I wake up. This dream expressed in a symbolic way an answer from the unconscious to the thoughts that the dreamer had had the evening before. It said to him, in effect, "You yourself must become a priest in your own inner church, in the church of your soul." Thus, the dream shows that the dreamer does have the helpful support of an organization. He is contained in a church, not an external church, but one that exists inside his own soul. The people, all his own psychic qualities, want him to function as the priest and celebrate the Mass himself. Now, the dream cannot mean the actual Mass, for its Mass book is very different from the real one. It seems that the idea of the Mass is used as a symbol, and therefore it means a sacrificial act in which the divinity is present, so that man can communicate with it. This symbolic solution is, of course, not generally valid, but relates to this particular dreamer. It is a typical solution for a Protestant, because a man who through real faith is still contained in the Catholic Church usually experiences his anima in the image of the Church herself, and her sacred images are for him the symbols of the unconscious. Our dreamer did not have this ecclesiastical experience, and this is why he had to follow an inner way. Furthermore, the dream told him what he should do. It said, "Your mother-boundness and your extroversion," represented by the wife who is an extrovert, "distract you and make you feel insecure, and by meaningless talk keep you from celebrating the inner Mass. But if you follow the nun, the introverted anima, she will lead you as both a servant and a priest. She owns a strange Mass book, which is composed of 16, 4 times 4, ancient pictures. Your Mass consists of your contemplation of these psychic images that your religious anima reveals to you. In other words, if the dreamer overcomes his inner uncertainty, caused by his mother complex, he will find that his life task has the nature and quality of a religious service, and that if he meditates about the symbolic meaning of the images in his soul, they will lead him to this realization. In this dream, the anima appears in her proper positive role, that is, as a mediator between the ego and the self. The 4 times 4 configuration of the pictures points to the fact that the celebration of this inner Mass is performed in the service of totality. As Jung has demonstrated, the nucleus of the psyche, the self, normally expresses itself in some kind of fourfold structure. The number 4 is also connected with the anima because, as Jung noted, there are 4 stages in its development. The first stage is best symbolized by the figure of Eve, which represents purely instinctual and biological relations. The second can be seen in Faust's Helen. She personifies a romantic and aesthetic level that is, however, still characterized by sexual elements. The third is represented, for instance, by the Virgin Mary, a figure who raises love, eros, to the heights of spiritual devotion. The fourth type is symbolized by sapientia, wisdom transcending even the most holy and the most pure. Of this, another symbol is the Shulamite in the Song of Solomon. In the psychic development of modern man, this stage is rarely reached. The Mona Lisa comes nearest to such a wisdom anima. At this stage, I am only pointing out that the concept of fourfoldness frequently occurs in certain types of symbolic material. The essential aspects of this will be discussed later. But what does the role of the anima as guide to the inner world mean in practical terms? This positive function occurs when a man takes seriously the feelings, moods, expectations, and fantasies sent by his anima, and when he fixes them in some form, for example, in writing, painting, sculpture, musical composition, or dancing. When he works at this patiently and slowly, other, more deeply unconscious material wells up from the depths and connects with the earlier material. After a fantasy has been fixed in some specific form, it must be examined both intellectually and ethically, with an evaluating feeling reaction. And it is essential to regard it as being absolutely real. There must be no lurking doubt that this is only a fantasy. If this is practiced with devotion over a long period, the process of individuation gradually becomes the single reality and can unfold in its true form. Many examples from literature show the anima as a guide and mediator to the inner world. Francesco Colonna's Hypnerotomachia, Rider Haggard's She, or the eternal feminine in Goethe's Faust. In a medieval mystical text, an anima figure explains her own nature as follows. I am the flower of the field and the lily of the valleys. I am the mother of fair love and of fear and of knowledge and of holy hope. I am the mediator of the elements, making one to agree with another. That which is warm I make cold, and the reverse, and that which is dry I make moist, and the reverse, and that which is hard I soften. I am the law in the priest, and the word in the prophet, and the counsel in the wise. I will kill, and I will make to live, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand.